In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, a man is found dead with no marks, no clues, no answers. Enter Miss Marple, a sharp-eyed spinster unraveling a web of secrets, a cryptic locket, a deadly vial of poison, a mysterious stranger, and a sister's hidden legacy. As whispers of debt and betrayal surface every cigarette butt, every anchor symbol pulls her closer to a truth no one saw coming. Can she solve the impossible before the killer slips away? The clock is ticking. Chapter 1. The Village Whisper. The village of St. Mary Mead lay quiet under a gray autumn sky, its cottages nestled like sleepy cats along narrow lanes. Leaves, red and gold, drifted from ancient oaks, carpeting the ground in a soft rustle. The quay air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke, a familiar comfort to the villagers who moved through their days with the steady rhythm of routine. But today, something felt off, like a note played wrong in a familiar song. Nobody could say exactly what it was, but whispers had begun to stir, soft as the wind through the hedgerows. Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and sharper mind, sat by her window in her cozy cottage, knitting needles clicking like a metronome. Her hands moved with practiced ease, looping soft pink wool into neat rows, but her gaze was fixed outside. She watched the village green, where children chased each other in circles, their laughter bright but fleeting. Beyond them, the postman cycled past, his bag heavy with letters, and Mrs. Price from the bakery hurried along with a basket of fresh loaves. Everything seemed normal, yet Miss Marple's fingers paused, the needle still. She felt it too, the unease like a shadow passing over the sun. St. Mary Mead was a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, or so they thought. Gossip flowed as freely as the tea poured at the Women's Institute meetings, and secrets rarely stayed hidden long. But this morning, the talk was different. It wasn't about Mrs. Baker's new hat or young Tommy's trouble at school. No, the whispers were about something darker, something nobody could quite pin down. It had started at dawn, when Old Man Harrow, the village's grumpiest farmer, was found dead in his barn. No blood, no wounds, no sign of a struggle, just Harrow slumped against a hay bale, his eyes wide open, staring at nothing. Miss Marple leaned forward, her pale blue eyes narrowing as she watched Mrs. Price stop to talk to Mr. Green, the butcher. Their heads bent close, their voices low. She couldn't hear them, but she didn't need to. She knew the signs of worry. Tight lips, quick glances, hands twisting together. Something about Harrow's death had rattled the village, and Miss Marple intended to find out why. She set her knitting aside and rose, smoothing her gray skirt. Her cottage was small but tidy, with lace curtains and a hearth that glowed warmly in the evenings. A tray of tea things sat on the table, the pot still steaming from her morning brew. She poured a fresh cup, the porcelain clinking softly, and sipped as she thought. Harrow was not a well-liked man. He was gruff, stubborn, and had a habit of shouting at anyone who crossed his path. But dislike wasn't the same as murder, and Miss Marple's mind was already turning over the possibilities. Murder, accident, or something else? The lack of clues intrigued her most. No clues meant someone had been very clever, or very desperate. The village clock struck 10, its chimes echoing over the green. Miss Marple glanced at the mantel where a small clock ticked in agreement. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, picked up her straw hat, and stepped outside. The air was cool with a bite that promised rain later. She walked slowly, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel path, her eyes taking in every detail. The vicarage loomed to her left, its ivy-covered walls hiding a garden where roses still bloomed despite the season. To her right, the post office stood, its red sign faded but proud. And ahead, the path to Harrow's farm wound through a copse of trees, dark and quiet. As she approached the farm, she saw a small crowd gathered near the barn. Constable Reed, young and earnest, stood at the center, his notebook open, his pencil scratching furiously. He was new to St. Mary Mead, sent from the nearby town of Much Benham, and his face showed the strain of a case that didn't add up. Beside him was Dr. Haydock, the village doctor, his bag at his feet as he spoke in low tones. A few villagers lingered nearby. Mrs. Baker, her hat askew, Mr. Green, wiping his hands on his apron, and young Sally, the milkmaid, her eyes red from crying. Miss Marple approached, her steps soft but deliberate. "Good morning, Constable," she said, her voice gentle but clear. "A sad day, I hear." Constable Reed looked up, startled, then tipped his hat. "Miss Marple, ma'am, yes, it's troubling. Old Harrow, gone just like that. No sense to it." Dr. Haydock nodded, his face grim. "I've seen my share of deaths, but this one's odd. No marks, no poison I can detect, no heart trouble that I knew of. It's as if he just stopped." Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles. "Stopped? How curious. And nothing out of place in the barn?" "Not a thing," Reed said, flipping through his notebook. "Hay bales neat, tools on the wall, no footprints but his own. It's like he sat down and died for no reason." "No reason is rarely the truth," Miss Marple said softly, almost to herself. She glanced at the barn, its wide doors open, revealing a dim interior. The smell of hay and old wood drifted out, mixed with something sharper, like fear. "May I take a look, Constable?" Reed hesitated, then nodded. "No harm, I suppose, just don't touch anything." Miss Marple stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the gloom. The barn was large, with high beams and a dirt floor packed hard from years of use. Hay bales were stacked in one corner. A pitchfork leaned against the wall, and a single lantern hung, from a hook, unlit. Harrow's body had been moved, taken to Dr. Haydock's surgery for examination. But the spot where he'd been found was marked by a chalk outline. Miss Marple stood over it, her hands clasped, her mind racing. She noticed the details others might miss. A scuff in the dirt, faint but there near the hay bales. A single straw bent at an odd angle caught in a crack in the floor, the faintest smell of tobacco lingering in the air. Harrow didn't smoke, she knew that much. Someone else had been here perhaps, or perhaps not. She filed the thought away, like a card in a library catalog to be revisited later. Outside, the crowd had grown. Mrs. Price was there now, her basket forgotten on the ground. "It's unnatural," she said, her voice loud enough to carry. Harrow was tough as nails. "He didn't just die." "Quiet, Martha," Mr. Green muttered, glancing at Reed. "No need to stir things up." But Miss Marple heard, and she saw the way Sally's shoulders stiffened at Mrs. Price's words. Sally, who delivered milk to Harrow's farm every morning. Sally, who had been crying. Miss Marple made a mental note to speak with her later, perhaps over a cup of tea. Young girls often knew more than they realized, especially in a village like this. She stepped back into the sunlight, blinking at the brightness. "Constable, have you spoken to everyone who saw Harrow yesterday?" Reed nodded. "As many as I could find. He was at the pub last night arguing with Tom Blake over some land dispute. Same old Harrow, loud and stubborn. Then he went home, far as anyone knows. Nobody saw him after that until Sally found him this morning." "Tom Blake," Miss Marple repeated, her tone thoughtful. Tom was a farmer too, younger than Harrow, with a temper that flared like dry tinder. Land disputes were common enough, but they rarely ended in death. Still, it was a place to start. She thanked Reed and Dr. Haydock, then made her way back toward the village, her mind turning over the facts like pieces of a puzzle. No clues, they said, but Miss Marple knew better. There were always clues, even if they hid in plain sight. A scuff, a straw, a whiff of tobacco, these were threads, and she would pull them until the truth unraveled. Back at her cottage, she settled into her armchair, her knitting in her lap. The village was quiet now, the crowd at the barn dispersing, but the whispers would continue. She thought of Harrow, his rough voice and hard eyes, and the life he'd lived in St. Mary Mead. He'd made enemies, that was certain. But who among them would go so far? And how when there was nothing to show for it? The clock ticked on and Miss Marple's needles began to move again, their rhythm steady as her thoughts. She remembered a time years ago when another death had puzzled the village. A housemaid found still in her bed with no sign of harm. That case, too, had seemed impossible. But Miss Marple had solved it by listening, watching, and piecing together the smallest hints. A dropped hairpin, a word overheard, a glance that lingered too long. This would be no different. She sipped her tea, now cold, and considered her next step. The pub, perhaps, where Harrow had argued with Tom Blake, or Sally, who might know more than she'd told. Or even the barn again, at dusk when the light might reveal what the morning hid. There was work to be done and Miss Marple was ready. The village might whisper, but she would listen. And in St. Mary Mead, where secrets never stayed buried long, Miss Marple would find the truth, no matter how impossible it seemed. The rest of the day passed in a blur of small tasks. Miss Marple tended her garden, pulling weeds from the rose beds and clipping stray branches. She baked scones, their warm scent filling the cottage, and shared them with her neighbor, Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife. Over tea, Mrs. Clement chattered about the village, her words a stream of gossip and worry. "They're saying it's a curse," she said, her eyes wide. "Old Harrow, struck down by something unnatural. You don't think so, do you, Jane?" Miss Marple smiled, her expression mild. "I think curses are often just stories we tell when we don't understand. But I'm sure we'll find an explanation, dear." Mrs. Clement nodded, reassured, but Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere. She thought of the barn, the chalk outline, the faint smell of tobacco. She thought of Sally's tears and Tom Blake's temper, and she thought of Harrow alone in the dark, his life snuffed out like a candle. That evening she walked to the Blue Boar, the village pub, where the air was thick with the smell of ale and pipe smoke. The room was crowded, voices loud with speculation. Tom Blake was there, his face red from drink or anger, his hands gripping a pint glass. Miss Marple took a seat in the corner, unnoticed, her ears open to every word. "He was a miserable old man," Tom was saying, his voice carrying, "always picking fights, but I didn't touch him, I swear." "Nobody's saying you did," said Mr. Pye, the landlord, polishing a glass. "But you two were at it last night, weren't you?" Tom scowled. "He wanted my land for his cows, said I owed him. Owed him, after all he's done?" Miss Marple listened, her face calm but her mind sharp. Tom's anger was real, but was it enough? She sipped her lemonade, watching the room. Sally was there too, serving drinks, her hands trembling as she set down a tray. Miss Marple caught, her eye offering a kind smile, and Sally hesitated before nodding back. The night grew late, and Miss Marple walked home under a sky heavy with clouds. The village was silent now, but the whispers lingered in her mind. She thought of the barn, the scuff, the straw. She thought of Tom's words and Sally's fear. And she thought of Harrow, dead with no reason, no clue. But there were clues, she knew. They were there, waiting to be found. And Miss Marple, with her quiet ways and clever mind, would find them. The village might call it impossible, but to her, it was only a matter of time. Chapter 2. A Death Unseen. The morning after Old Man Harrow's death, St. Mary Mead woke to a drizzle that blurred the edges of the village like a smudged watercolor. The air was heavy, damp, and cool, carrying the scent of wet leaves and chimney smoke. Miss Jane Marple stood at her garden gate, her umbrella tilted against the rain, her sharp eyes scanning the lane. The village felt hushed, as if holding its breath, waiting for answers that hadn't come. She adjusted her shawl, her mind already picking at the threads of yesterday's discovery, the barn, the chalk outline, the faint whiff of tobacco that didn't belong. She'd slept little, her thoughts circling the puzzle of Harrow's death. No marks, no struggle, no obvious cause. Dr. Haydock had called it odd, and Constable Reed had no leads. Yet Miss Marple knew that even the quietest deaths left whispers, if you knew where to listen. Today, she would listen closely. Her first stop was the post office, where gossip gathered like dust in the corners. The bell above the door jingled as she entered, shaking rain from her umbrella. Mrs. Wicks, the postmistress, looked up from sorting letters, her round face flushed with the morning's chatter. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said, her voice bright but edged with nerves. Terrible business about Harrow, isn't it? Everyone's talking. Indeed, Miss Marple replied, setting her umbrella by the door. And what are they saying, Mrs. Wicks? Mrs. Wicks leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. Some say it's unnatural. No reason for a man like Harrow to just drop dead. Others think it's that Tom Blake always fighting with Harrow over that strip of land by the creek. And then there's Sally, poor thing, finding him like that. She's not been herself since. Miss Marple nodded, her expression mild, but her mind sharp. Sally did seem upset yesterday. Has she said anything more? Not much, Mrs. Wicks said, lowering her voice. But she was here earlier, posting a letter. Looked pale as a ghost, hands shaking. Said she keeps seeing Harrow's face staring up at nothing. Miss Marple tucked that away, like a pebble in her pocket. Sally's fear was more than shock, she suspected. Fear often hid knowledge, even if the person didn't realize it. And Tom Blake? She asked. Has he been in? Mrs. Wicks snorted. Oh, he was here at dawn sending a parcel to his sister in Much Benham. Grumbling as usual, but he didn't mention Harrow. Still, you know how he is. Hot-headed, always ready for a row. Miss Marple thanked her and stepped back into the rain, her mind turning over the names. Sally, Tom, Harrow. The land dispute was a thread worth pulling, but it was too obvious, too loud. The real clues, she knew, were quieter, hidden in glances, hesitations, things left unsaid. Her next stop was the vicarage, where Mrs. Clement would be preparing for the Women's Institute meeting. The vicarage garden was a riot of late roses, their petals drooping under the rain. Mrs. Clement opened the door, her apron dusted with flour, her face brightening at the sight of Miss Marple. Jane. Come in, you'll catch your death in this weather, she said, ushering her inside. The kitchen smelled of baking bread, warm and comforting. Have you heard anything new about Harrow? Not much, Miss Marple said, settling into a chair by the fire. But I'm curious about the village's mood. People seem unsettled. Mrs. Clement sighed, wiping her hands on her apron. They are. It's not just Harrow's death, it's how it happened. No reason, no sense. At the pub last night, some were saying it's a judgment. Harrow wasn't kind, you know. Always, snapping at people, cheating on deals. But death like that? It's eerie. Miss Marple sipped the tea Mrs. Clement offered, her eyes drifting to the window. Did Harrow have enemies, do you think? Beyond Tom Blake? Mrs. Clement hesitated, her hand stilling. Well, he wasn't loved, that's certain. He argued with half the village, Mr. Green over meat prices, Mrs. Price over bread deliveries, even the vicar once about church donations. But enemies? I don't know. Nobody hated him enough to… Well, you know. Miss Marple nodded, but her mind caught on the hesitation. Mrs. Clement knew more than she was saying, perhaps without realizing it. People often did. And Sally? She asked gently. She worked for Harrow, didn't she? Oh yes, delivering milk every morning, Mrs. Clement said. Poor girl. She's only 16 and finding him like that. It's shaken her. She told me she feels guilty, though I can't think why. Guilty, Miss Marple repeated softly, her needles clicking as she pulled her knitting from her bag. The word hung in the air, heavy with possibility. Guilt could mean many things, regret, fear, or something deeper. She would need to talk to Sally soon. After tea, Miss Marple walked to the Blue Boar, where the lunchtime crowd would be gathering. The pub was warm and noisy, the air thick with the smell of ale and roasted meat. Mr. Pye, the landlord, nodded as she entered, his hands busy pouring pints. Miss Marple took her usual corner table, her lemonade untouched as she listened to the voices around her. Tom Blake was there, his voice loud over the hum of conversation. I'm telling you I didn't touch him, he said, slamming his glass down. Harrow was a cheat, but I wouldn't kill him over a bit of land. Nobody's accusing you, Tom, said Mr. Green, the butcher, though his tone lacked conviction. But you were shouting at him that night, everyone heard. Miss Marple's eyes flicked to Tom, noting the flush in his cheeks, the way his hands clenched. Anger, yes, but fear too? She couldn't tell yet. She glanced at Sally, who was clearing tables, her movements quick and nervous. When their eyes met, Sally looked away, her lips trembling. Miss Marple rose and approached her, her voice soft. "Sally, dear, might I have a word?" Sally nodded, wiping her hands on her apron. They stepped outside under the pub's awning, where the rain pattered softly. "I know this must be hard," Miss Marple said. "Finding Mr. Harrow like that. Would you tell me what you saw?" Sally's eyes filled with tears. "It was awful, Miss Marple. He was just sitting there against the hay, his eyes open. I thought he was asleep at first, but then I saw he wasn't breathing. I called for help, but it was too late. Did you notice anything unusual?" Miss Marple asked, her tone gentle but probing. "Anything out of place?" Sally shook her head, then paused. "Well, there was a smell. Like cigarettes, maybe, but Mr. Harrow didn't smoke. I thought it was odd, but I was so scared I didn't think much of it." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her face remained calm. "A smell of cigarettes. Interesting. Anything else, dear?" Sally bit her lip. I don't know. I keep thinking I should have checked on him sooner. I was late that morning, you see. Overslept. If I'd been there earlier—" "You mustn't blame yourself," Miss Marple said, patting her hand. "You did all you could." But as Sally returned to work, Miss Marple's mind raced. The tobacco. Smell again, faint but persistent. And Sally's guilt, oversleeping, yes, but was there more? She filed it away, along with Tom's anger and Mrs. Clement's hesitation. That afternoon she visited the barn again, slipping past Constable Reed's makeshift barrier. The rain had stopped, leaving the air fresh and the ground muddy. Inside, the barn was as she'd left it, hay bales neat, tools in place, the chalk outline stark against the dirt. She knelt, her knees creaking, and studied the scuff mark she'd noticed yesterday. It was deeper than she'd thought, as if someone had dragged their foot. Nearby, the bent straw was gone, swept away or taken. She frowned, her fingers brushing the floor. Someone had been here since yesterday, tidying up. She stood, her eyes scanning the beams overhead. A glint caught her attention, a tiny sliver of metal wedged in a crack. She reached up, careful not to disturb it, and saw it was a cigarette butt, half burned, its paper crumpled. Harrow didn't smoke, and neither did most of the villagers she knew. This was something new, something out of place. She left the barn, her mind buzzing. The cigarette butt, the scuff, Sally's guilt, Tom's anger. It was a tangle, but tangles could be unraveled. Back at her cottage, she sat by the fire, her knitting needles moving as her thoughts wove together. The village was full of secrets, small and large, and Harrow's death was tied to one of them. She would need to be patient, to listen and watch, to let the truth reveal itself. As night fell, the rain returned, tapping against her windows. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes on the flickering flames. The village whispered, and she listened. Somewhere in the quiet spaces between words, the answer was waiting. Chapter 3. The House on the Hill. The rain had stopped by the third morning since Old Man Harrow's death, leaving St. Mary Mead sparkling under a weak sun. Puddles gleamed in the lanes, and the air carried the clean, earthy scent of wet grass. Miss Jane Marple stood at her cottage door, her scarf knotted neatly, her eyes fixed on the hill beyond the village. There, perched like a lonely sentinel, was Harrow's house, a gray stone building half hidden by overgrown hedges, its windows dark and unwelcoming. She'd passed it many times, but never entered. Today, she decided, that would change. Her knitting bag swung lightly at her side as she walked, her sensible shoes squelching in the damp earth. The village was waking slowly, with chimney smoke curling into the sky and the distant clatter of milk bottles from Sally's delivery round. Miss Marple's mind was busy, turning over the threads she'd gathered. The cigarette butt in the Yate barn, the scuff mark in the dirt, Sally's trembling guilt, Tom Blake's loud anger. Each was a piece of the puzzle, but the picture was still blurry. Harrow's house, she hoped, might sharpen it. The path to the hill was steep, winding through a field of grazing sheep. Their bleats mixed with the rustle of leaves, and Miss Marple paused to catch her breath, her hand resting on a wooden stile. From here she could see the village spread out below, cottages clustered around the green, the church spire piercing the sky, the blue boar sign swinging gently. It was a peaceful view, but peace, she knew, often hid trouble. At the house, the gate creaked as she pushed it open. The garden was a tangle of weeds and thorns, the roses long gone to seed. The front door, heavy oak with a brass knocker, stood slightly ajar, as if someone had left in a hurry. Miss Marple frowned, her fingers tightening on her bag. Constable. Reed had mentioned locking the place after Harrow's body was found, but locks, like secrets, didn't always hold. She knocked, more out of habit than expectation, and when no answer came, she stepped inside. The air was stale, thick with dust and the faint smell of old books. The hall was dim, its walls lined with faded photographs. Harrow as a younger man, stern-faced, standing beside a plow. Harrow with a woman, perhaps his late wife, her smile, soft but sad. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the woman's face, noting the tight lines around her mouth. Sorrow, she thought. Or fear. The parlor was to the left, its furniture heavy and old-fashioned. A fireplace stood cold, its grate filled with ash. On the mantel, a clock had stopped at 3:30, its hands frozen. Miss Marple tilted her head, her mind ticking like the clock should have. 3:30, morning or afternoon, and when? She made a note to ask Constable Reed if anyone had checked the house the night Harrow died. She moved to the desk, cluttered with papers, bills, receipts, a crumpled map of the village. One sheet caught her eye, a letter, half-written. The ink smudged as if abandoned mid-sentence. It was addressed to Mr. T. Blake and began, "You will not take what is mine." The rest was illegible, the words smeared into a black blur. Miss Marple's lips pursed. Tom Blake again, tied to Harrow by anger and land. But a letter wasn't proof, only another thread. Upstairs, the bedrooms were sparse, the beds unmade. Harrow's room smelled of liniment and tobacco. Not the cigarette kind, but the heavy, sweet scent of a pipe. She paused, her nose wrinkling. Pipe tobacco in the house. Cigarette smoke in the barn. 2 different smokers, perhaps? Or one person, trying to hide their tracks? She filed the thought away, her eyes scanning the room. A single photograph sat on the bedside table. Harrow and his wife again, younger, standing by a stream. The woman's hand rested on Harrow's arm, but her eyes looked elsewhere, distant and troubled. In the second bedroom, likely a guest room, the bed was neatly made, but a faint dent in the pillow suggested someone had slept there recently. Miss Marple touched the pillow, her fingers light. The linen was crisp, freshly changed. Odd for a house where Harrow lived alone. She checked the wardrobe, finding only a few moth-eaten coats, but under the bed she found a small button, brass with a tiny anchor etched on it. Not Harrow's style, she thought. A sailor's button, perhaps, or a decorative one from a fine coat. She slipped it into her pocket, careful not to smudge it. Downstairs again, she explored the kitchen where a single plate sat in the sink, crusted with dried gravy. A loaf of bread, half-eaten, lay on the counter, its crust gone stale. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Harrow had eaten alone, it seemed, but the plate was fine china, not the rough pottery she'd expect from a farmer. Another small oddity, another thread. As she left the house, locking the door behind her, she heard footsteps on the path. It was Sally, her milk cart rattling, her face pale under her bonnet. "Miss Marple," she called, her voice shaky. "What are you doing here?" "Just looking about, dear," Miss Marple said, her smile kind but her eyes sharp. "Did you deliver milk here yesterday?" Sally nodded, her hands twisting together. "Yes, ma'am. Every morning at 6. But I didn't go inside. Just left the bottles by the door." "And the door was closed?" Miss Marple asked. Sally hesitated, her eyes darting to the house. I think so. It's always closed. But yesterday I was in such a rush I didn't notice." Miss Marple patted her arm. "No matter, dear. You've had a hard time. Why don't you come to my cottage later? We'll have tea." Sally nodded, her relief palpable, and hurried off with her cart. Miss Marple watched her go, her mind turning over Sally's hesitation. The girl was hiding something, perhaps not on purpose, but hiding all the same. Fear, guilt, or knowledge. Only time would tell. Back in the village, Miss Marple stopped at the butcher's shop, where Mr. Green was chopping meat with a heavy cleaver. His apron was stained, his face flushed from work. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, wiping his hands. "Heard you were at the barn yesterday, poking about, eh?" "Just curious," she said, her tone light. "Mr. Harrow's death is quite the mystery, isn't it? I heard he argued with you, too, about prices." Mr. Green snorted, his cleaver pausing. "Harrow argued with everyone. Wanted my best cuts for half the price, but I didn't kill him, if that's what you're thinking." "Of course not," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "But you were at the pub that night, weren't you? Did you see anything unusual?" Mr. Green frowned, his hands still. "Well, now you mention it, there was a stranger there. Tall, fellow dark coat, kept to himself in the corner. Left before Harrow and Tom started shouting. Didn't think much of it till now." "A stranger," Miss Marple repeated, her heart quickening. "Did he smoke by chance?" Mr. Green nodded. "Cigarettes, I think. Smelled strong, not like the usual pipe smoke." Miss Marple thanked him and left, her mind buzzing. A stranger, a cigarette, a button with an anchor. The threads were multiplying, weaving a pattern she couldn't yet see. She returned to her cottage, where the fire crackled warmly, and sat with her knitting, her needles clicking as her thoughts spun. The house on the hill had given her new clues: the smudged letter, the stopped clock, the brass button, the dented pillow. And now, a stranger in the pub smoking cigarettes. She thought of Sally's fear, Tom's anger, Mr. Green's unease. The village was full of secrets, and Harrow's death was at the heart of one. She sipped her tea, her eyes on the flames, and let her mind wander. Years ago, in another village, she'd solved a case much like this, a death with no cause, no clues. It had been a matter of listening, of noticing the small things, a misplaced key, a word unspoken, a shadow where none should be. This case was no different. The answers were there, in the house, the barn, the village. She would find them, one thread at a time. As dusk fell, the village grew quiet, the lights in the cottages glowing like stars. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and looked out her window, toward the hill. The house stood silent, its secrets locked inside. But locks, like mysteries, could be opened. And Miss Marple, with her quiet ways and clever mind, held the key. Chapter 4. Shadows of Doubt. The fourth day since Old Man Harrow's death dawned crisp and bright, with a breeze that swept away the last of the rain clouds. St. Mary Mead sparkled in the sunlight, its cottages glowing like polished stones, but the village's cheer hid a growing unease. Whispers of Harrow's death had spread like ripples in a pond, touching every corner of the community. Miss Jane Marple, standing at her garden gate, felt the weight of those whispers as she watched the village come to life. Her knitting bag hung over her arm, a familiar companion, but her mind was far from the soft wool inside. She was thinking of the house on the hill, the cigarette butt, the brass button, and the stranger Mr. Green had mentioned. Today, she decided she would visit the church. The vicar, Mr. Clement, was a kind man but easily flustered, and his wife had hinted at Harrow's argument with him over donations. Arguments, Miss Marple knew, often revealed more than their words. She adjusted her hat, a simple straw one with a ribbon, and set off down the lane, her steps steady despite the slight ache in her knees. The church sat at the heart of St. Mary Mead, its stone walls weathered but proud, its spire catching the morning light. The graveyard beside it was quiet, with moss-covered stones leaning like old friends. Miss Marple paused at the gate, her eyes scanning the names etched in stone. Harrow's wife, Ellen, rested here, gone 5 years now. Her grave was tidy, with fresh daisies in a small vase. Someone still cared, it seemed. Miss Marple made a mental note to ask who tended it. Inside, the church was cool and dim, smelling of polished wood and candle wax. Mr. Clement was at the altar, arranging hymnals, his glasses slipping down his nose. He looked up as Miss Marple approached, his face breaking into a nervous smile. "Miss Marple, a pleasure as always," he said, brushing dust from his hands. "Though I suppose you're here about, well, the dreadful business with Harrow." She nodded, settling into a pew. "It's troubled the village, hasn't it? I heard you and Mr. Harrow had words recently." Mr. Clement's smile faltered, his fingers fidgeting with a hymnal. "Oh, nothing serious. He was, reluctant to give. To the church fund. Said he needed his money for the farm. I tried to reason with him, but you know how he was. Stubborn as a mule." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle but her eyes sharp. "When was this, Mr. Clement?" "Last week, I think. Tuesday after evensong," he said, his brow furrowing. He was in a foul mood, muttering about debts and land. I didn't press him, but, well, it wasn't pleasant. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she pulled her knitting from her bag, a habit that helped her think. "Debts," she repeated. "Did he mention anyone specific?" Mr. Clement hesitated, his eyes darting to the stained glass window above. "Not by name, but he said someone was bleeding him dry. His words, not mine. I assumed it was Tom Blake with their land dispute, but it could have been anyone." Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloging the detail. Debts were a motive, one she hadn't considered fully. Harrow's farm was prosperous enough, or so it seemed, but appearances could deceive. She thanked Mr. Clement and left, her thoughts turning to the stranger in the pub. A creditor, perhaps, or someone else entirely. Her next stop was the village shop, where Mrs. Price was stacking jars of jam behind the counter. The shop was small, its shelves crammed with everything from flour to boot polish, and it buzzed with gossip. Mrs. Price looked up as Miss Marple entered, her face lighting up with curiosity. "Miss Marple, come to buy or to snoop?" she teased, wiping her hands on her apron. "A bit of both," Miss Marple said with a smile, picking up a tin of biscuits. "I was wondering about Mr. Harrow. You delivered bread to him, didn't you?" Mrs. Price nodded, her expression souring. "Every other day, though he was never grateful, always complaining about the price, saying I was cheating him. Cheating, as if I'd risked my reputation." "Did he owe you money?" Miss Marple asked, her tone casual. Mrs. Price hesitated, then leaned closer. "Well, yes, a bit. A few pounds for the month's deliveries. He promised to pay last week, but then, well, you know." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her face remained calm. Another debt, another thread. "Did you see anyone at his house recently? Anyone unusual?" Mrs. Price thought for a moment, her brow creasing. "Come to think of it, I saw a man near his gate 2 days before he died. Tall, dark coat, city type. Didn't look like he belonged here. I thought he was a salesman, but he didn't come to the village." Miss Marple's fingers paused on her knitting. The stranger again, matching Mr. Green's description. "Did he smoke by chance?" Mrs. Price's eyes widened. "Now you mention it, yes. I saw him light a cigarette as he walked away. Funny thing to notice, but it stood out." Miss Marple thanked her and left, her mind racing. The stranger was becoming a shadow, present but unseen, leaving only cigarette smoke and questions. She decided to visit Tom Blake's farm next to see what his side of the land dispute might reveal. Tom's farm was a mile outside the village, its fields neat but smaller than Harrow's. He was in the yard, mending a fence, his shirt damp with sweat. He straightened as Miss Marple approached, his face wary. "Miss Marple," he said, wiping his brow. "Heard you've been asking questions. I didn't kill Harrow, if that's why you're here." "I'm only trying to understand," she said, her voice soft. "You and Mr. Harrow argued about land, didn't you?" Tom snorted, tossing his hammer into the grass. "He wanted my field by the creek for his cows. Said it was rightfully his, some old claim from his grandfather's time. I told him to shove it. That land's been mine for years. Did he threaten you?" Miss Marple asked, her eyes on his clenched fists. Tom's jaw tightened. "He said he'd make me pay one way or another. But I didn't touch him. Last I saw him was at the pub. Night before he died. Miss Marple nodded, noting the edge in his voice. Anger, yes, but something else. Fear, perhaps, or guilt. Did you see anyone else that night? A stranger, maybe? Tom frowned, scratching his chin. There was a fellow at the pub, yeah, kept to himself, dark coat, left early. Didn't think much of it. Miss Marple thanked him and turned back toward the village, her mind weaving the new threads. Harrow's debts, the stranger's cigarette, Tom's defensiveness. She thought of the button with the anchor, still in her pocket. It didn't fit. Tom, who wore plain work clothes, nor Harrow, whose tastes were simple. The stranger, perhaps? Or someone else entirely? Back at her cottage, she sat by the fire, her knitting needles moving steadily. The village was a web of connections, debts, grudges, secrets, and Harrow's death was the knot at its center. She thought of Sally, who hadn't come for tea as promised, and the dented pillow in Harrow's guest room. Someone had been in that house, someone who didn't belong, and the stranger, always the stranger, hovering like a ghost. That evening, she walked to the Blue Boar where the crowd was thinner but the air still thick with talk. Sally was there, her eyes red-rimmed, her hands unsteady as she poured ale. Miss Marple caught her at a quiet moment, her voice gentle. "Sally, dear, you didn't come for tea. Is everything all right?" Sally's lip trembled, and she looked away. "I'm sorry, Miss Marple, I've been so scared. I keep thinking about Mr. Harrow and that morning. I should have told you, I saw something." Miss Marple's heart skipped, but she kept her tone calm. "What did you see, dear?" Sally glanced around, her voice barely a whisper. "When I left the milk, I saw a shadow by the barn, someone moving, quick, like they didn't want to be seen. I thought it was nothing, but now, I don't know." Miss Marple patted her hand, her mind racing. A shadow, a stranger, a cigarette, a button. The pieces were there, scattered but real. She thanked Sally and returned home, the night closing around her like a curtain. As she sat by her fire, the village silent outside, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to another case, years ago. A theft with no clues, solved by a single footprint, in the mud. This was no different. The shadows of doubt were growing, but so was the light of truth. She would find it, one careful step at a time. Chapter 5. The Silent Witness. The 5th morning in St. Mary Mead broke with a golden glow, the sun painting the village in warm hues that belied the chill in the air. Dew glistened on the grass, and the distant bleat of sheep carried from the fields. Miss Jane Marple stood at her window, her knitting untouched on the table, her eyes tracing the familiar lanes of the village. The whispers about old man Harrow's death had grown louder, threading through every conversation like a stubborn stitch. Sally's mention of a shadow by the barn, the stranger with his cigarettes, the brass button with its tiny anchor. These were clues, small but sharp, and Miss Marple was determined to follow them. Today, she decided, she would seek out someone who saw more than they spoke. In a village like St. Mary Mead, there was always a silent witness, someone who noticed without being noticed. Her thoughts turned to old Mrs. Finch, the widow who lived at the edge of the village, her cottage overlooking the path to Harrow's farm. Mrs. Finch was nearly 90, her eyes cloudy but her memory sharp as a tack. She spent her days by her window watching the world with a quiet intensity that reminded Miss Marple of herself. With her shawl wrapped tight and her knitting bag in hand, Miss Marple set out. The village was stirring, with children running to school and Mr. Green sweeping the step of his butcher shop. She nodded to passers-by, her smile polite, but her mind elsewhere. The clues were piling up. The smudged letter to Tom Blake, the stopped clock in Harrow's parlor, the dented pillow in his guest room, and now Sally's shadow. Each was a thread, and Mrs. Finch might hold another. The widow's cottage was small, its thatched roof sagging like an old hat. The garden was a riot of herbs and wildflowers, tended by Mrs. Finch's great-niece, who visited weekly. Miss Marple knocked, and the door creaked open to reveal Mrs. Finch, her white hair tucked under a lace cap, her hands folded in her lap. "Miss Marple, what a surprise," she said, her voice thin but warm. "Come in, come in. I've got the kettle on." The cottage was cozy, with a fire crackling and a tabby cat curled on the hearth. Miss Marple settled into a worn armchair, accepting a cup of tea. "I hope I'm not troubling you, Mrs. Finch," she said, her tone gentle. "I've been thinking about poor Mr. Harrow. You live so close to his farm. Did you see anything that morning?" Mrs. Finch's eyes, cloudy but keen, met hers. "I see a lot from my window, Jane. Not much happens on that path I don't notice. The morning he died, I was up early, as always. Saw Sally with her milk cart, late as usual, poor girl. But there was someone else, too." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her face stayed calm. "Someone else?" Mrs. Finch nodded, her fingers tracing the arm of her chair. "A man, tall, in a dark coat. He came down the hill from Harrow's place just before dawn. Moved quick, like he didn't want to be seen. I thought he was a worker at first, but he wasn't dressed like a farmer. City clothes, I'd say." "Did you see his face?" Miss Marple asked, her needles clicking softly as she pulled her knitting from her bag. Mrs. Finch shook her head. "Too dark, and my eyes aren't what they were. But he stopped by the hedge, lit a cigarette. I saw the match flare, smelled the smoke even from here. Odd that. Most folks round here smoke pipes, if they smoke at all." Miss Marple's mind raced. The stranger again matching Mr. Green's and Mrs. Price's descriptions. A cigarette, a dark coat, a shadow by the barn. "Did you see him go back to the village?" she asked. "No," Mrs. Finch said, her brow creasing. "He went the other way, toward the old mill road. Nobody lives out there, just fields and ruins. I thought it queer, but then Sally screamed, and I saw her running from the barn. That's when I knew something was wrong." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her thoughts spinning. The mill road led nowhere, or so it seemed, a dead end, overgrown and forgotten. Why would the stranger go that way? She thanked Mrs. Finch and promised to return, her mind already on the mill road. It was a place to explore, a place where secrets might hide. Her next stop was the school, where the children were at recess, their shouts filling the air. Miss Marple stood by the gate, watching for Tommy, the baker's son, who was known for wandering where he shouldn't. If anyone had seen something near the mill road, it might be him. She spotted him kicking a ball, his hair tousled, his grin wide. "Tommy," she called, waving him over. "Might I have a word?" He trotted over, his cheeks flushed. "Yes, Miss Marple. Ma said you're asking about Mr. Harrow." "I am," she said, her smile kind. "You're often out exploring, aren't you? Have you been near the old mill road lately?" Tommy's eyes widened, then darted away. "Maybe. I wasn't supposed to be there." Made me cross. "I won't tell," Miss Marple said, her tone conspiratorial. "Did you see anything unusual?" Tommy kicked at the dirt, his voice low. "Saw a man there, day before Mr. Harrow died. Tall, dark coat. He was poking around the mill ruins like he was looking for something. I hid in the bushes, didn't want him to see me." "Did he do anything else?" Miss Marple asked, her needles pausing. "He dropped something," Tommy said. "Looked like a paper or a letter. Picked it up quick, though, and left. I didn't get a good look." Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloging the detail. A paper, dropped and retrieved. Another clue, small but significant. She gave Tommy a peppermint from her bag and sent him back to his game, her thoughts turning to the mill road. It was time to see it for herself. The mill road was a narrow track, overgrown with nettles and brambles. The old mill, abandoned years ago, stood at its end, its wheels still and its stones crumbling. Miss Marple walked carefully, her eyes scanning the ground. The path was muddy with faint footprints, large like a man's, leading to the mill and back. She followed them to the ruins, where the air smelled of damp stone and decay. Inside, the mill was a skeleton of beams and shadows. Dust motes danced in the sunlight, and the floor was littered with broken glass and leaves. Miss Marple moved slowly, her eyes sharp. Near a collapsed wall, she found a scrap of paper, torn and smudged with mud. It was a corner of an envelope, addressed to J. Harrow, Esker, in a neat, unfamiliar hand. No stamp, no postmark. Hand-delivered, perhaps. She tucked it into her pocket beside the brass button. As she left the mill, a rustle in the bushes made her pause. She turned, her heart steady, and saw only a rabbit darting away. But the feeling of being watched lingered, prickling her skin. Someone had been here, and recently. The stranger, perhaps, or another silent witness. Back in the village, she stopped, at the post office, to ask Mrs. Wicks about the envelope. The postmistress shook her head. No letters for Harrow lately, not that I've seen. But I don't handle everything. Some folks deliver their own. Miss Marple thanked her and returned, home, her mind buzzing. The envelope, the footprints, the stranger's cigarette. They were pieces of a puzzle, scattered but connecting. She thought of Sally's shadow, Tommy's story, Mrs. Finch's sharp eyes. The village was full of eyes, watching, waiting, and someone knew more than they said. That evening she sat by her fire, her knitting needles moving as her thoughts wove together. The mill road was a dead end, but it led somewhere, to a truth, a motive, a secret. She thought of Harrow's debts, his arguments, his lonely house. She thought of the stranger always out of reach, leaving only smoke and shadows. And she thought of another case long ago, where a torn letter had unlocked a mystery. This was no different. The silent witnesses were speaking. If only she could hear them clearly. As the village settled into night, its lights dim and its lanes quiet, Miss Marple looked out her window. The hill loomed dark, Harrow's house a silent sentinel. The truth was there, hidden in the shadows of doubt. She would find it, one careful step at a time. Chapter 6. Miss Marple's Arrival. The 6th day since old man Harrow's death brought a soft mist to St. Mary Mead, cloaking the village in a silvery haze that muffled sound and softened edges. The cottages seemed to huddle closer, their chimneys puffing smoke like cautious whispers. Miss Jane Marple stood at her cottage door, her shawl draped over her shoulders, her knitting bag in hand. The mist suited her mood, quiet, elusive, hiding secrets in plain sight. She'd been in the village all along, of course, but today felt different, as if she were truly arriving at the heart of the mystery. The clues were mounting: the cigarette butt, the brass button, the torn envelope, Sally's shadow, and the stranger who slipped through every story like a ghost. Today she would pull these threads tighter. Her first task was to revisit Sally, the milkmaid, whose fear and guilt hinted at more than she'd said. Miss Marple walked slowly through the mist, her sensible shoes tapping on the damp cobblestones. The village was quiet, with only the clink of milk bottles and the distant bark of a dog breaking the silence. She found Sally at the dairy, her hands busy with churns, her face pale and drawn. "Good morning, Sally," Miss Marple said, her voice warm but firm. "I hoped we might talk again. You've been on my mind." Sally's hands stilled, her eyes flicking nervously to the door. "Miss Marple, I don't know what else to say. I told you about the shadow." "You did, dear," Miss Marple said, settling onto a wooden bench. "But sometimes we remember more when we talk. That morning at Harrow's farm. Tell me. Everything, even the little things." Sally bit her lip, wiping her hands on her apron. "It was just like I said. I was late, overslept. Got to the farm around 6:30, left the milk by the door. Then I went to the barn to check the churns, and there he was, sitting against the hay, eyes open. I screamed and ran." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking as she pulled her knitting from her bag. "And the shadow? You saw it by the barn?" "Yes," Sally whispered, her voice barely audible. "Just a shape, moving fast toward the trees. I thought it was a fox at first, but it was too tall. I didn't look long, I was too scared." "Did you notice anything else?" Miss Marple asked, her eyes gentle but probing. "A sound? A smell?" Sally hesitated, her fingers twisting together. "There was, a whistle. Soft, like someone calling a dog, but there was no dog. It came from the trees where the shadow went." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her face remained calm. A whistle, a new detail, small but sharp. "Thank you, Sally. You've been very helpful." Come for tea soon, won't you?" Sally nodded, her relief palpable, and Miss Marple left, her mind buzzing. A whistle, a shadow, a cigarette. The stranger was no longer just a figure in a dark coat. He was a presence, moving with purpose. She decided to visit the trees near Harrow's barn, where the shadow had vanished. The path to the farm was slick with mist, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth. The barn loomed ahead, its doors still sealed with Constable Reed's tape. Miss Marple skirted it, heading for the copse of trees Sally had mentioned. The ground was soft, marked with faint footprints, too muddled to read clearly but recent. She crouched, her knees creaking, and studied the underbrush. There, caught on a thorn, was a scrap of fabric, dark blue, fine wool, not the rough cloth of a farmer's coat. She tucked it into her pocket, beside the button and the envelope scrap. The trees were dense, their branches forming a canopy that blocked the sun. Miss Marple moved carefully, her eyes scanning the ground. Near a gnarled oak, she found a flattened patch of grass, as if someone had stood there for some time. Nearby, a cigarette butt lay half buried in the dirt, its paper, yellowed but intact. She didn't touch it but noted its brand, different from the one in the barn, cheaper, with a faint red stain on the filter. Lipstick, perhaps. The thought was intriguing. Few women in St. Mary Mead wore lipstick and none smoked cigarettes, as far as she knew. She left the copse and headed to the Blue Boar, where the lunchtime crowd would be gathering. The pub was warm, its windows fogged from the heat of bodies and the fire. Mr. Pye, the landlord, greeted her with a nod, his hands busy polishing glasses. "Miss Marple back again?" he said, a smile tugging at his lips. "You're keeping us on our toes with all this snooping." "Just curious," she said, settling at her corner table with a lemonade. "I heard there was a stranger here the night before Harrow died. Have you seen him since?" Mr. Pye frowned, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Not since that night. Tall fellow, dark coat, kept to himself. Paid in cash, didn't talk much. Smoked like a chimney, though. Left cigarette butts all over the floor." Miss Marple's fingers paused on her knitting. "Did he speak to anyone? Harrow, perhaps?" "Not that I saw," Mr. Pye said. "Kept his head down, left before the row between Harrow and Tom Blake got loud. But, now you mention it, he was watching them. Not obvious, but I saw his eyes." Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloging the detail. The stranger had been watching, listening, perhaps planning. She scanned the pub, noting Tom Blake's absence but spotting Mrs. Price, who was chatting with Mrs. Baker. Their voices were low, their glances furtive. Miss Marple caught a snippet of their talk, something about a letter Harrow had received, one he'd been angry about. She approached them, her smile disarming. "Good afternoon, ladies. I couldn't help overhearing. Did you say Mr. Harrow got a letter?" Mrs. Price flushed, her hands twisting her scarf. "Oh, just gossip, Miss Marple. I heard from Sally that Harrow was waving a letter around a few days before he died, shouting about someone owing him. Didn't say who." Miss Marple's heart quickened. Another letter? Or the same one she'd found smudged in his parlor? "Did Sally say anything else?" she asked. Mrs. Baker leaned in, her voice a whisper. "She said Harrow burned it right there in his kitchen. Said it was no good to anyone now." "Strange, isn't it?" Miss Marple agreed, her mind racing. A burned letter, a smudged letter, an envelope scrap. The pieces were connecting, but the pattern was still unclear. She thanked them and left, her thoughts turning to the vicarage. Mr. Clement might know more about Harrow's debts, and his wife might have overheard something useful. At the vicarage, Mrs. Clement was in the garden, clipping roses. She waved Miss Marple over, her face bright, but her eyes worried. "Jane, you're out and about early. Still thinking about Harrow?" "Always," Miss Marple said, settling onto a garden bench. "I heard he was in debt. Did he ever mention anything to you or the vicar?" Mrs. Clement's scissors paused, her brow creasing. "Not directly, but he was upset last month, said someone was pressing him for money he didn't have. I thought it was just his usual grumbling, but now—" Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking. "And did you see anyone near his farm recently? A stranger, perhaps?" Mrs. Clement's eyes widened, Funny you should ask. I saw a man on the hill 2 nights before Harrow died. Dark coat, tall. He was standing by the gate just looking at the house. I didn't think much of it then, but it was odd. Miss Marple thanked her and returned home, her mind a whirl of clues. The whistle in the trees, the scrap of fabric, the second cigarette butt, the burned letter. The stranger was everywhere, yet nowhere. She sat by her fire, her knitting steady, and thought of another case years ago where a stranger had been the key. A man who watched, waited, and struck. This was no different. The silent witness was out there, and she would find them. As night fell, the mist thickened, wrapping St. Mary Mead in a soft shroud. Miss Marple looked out her window, the hill barely visible. The truth was close. Hidden, in the shadows. She would find it, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 7. Tea and Suspicion. The 7th day since Old Man Harrow's death brought a gentle warmth to St. Mary Mead, the mist of the previous day giving way to a soft blue sky. The village hummed with its usual rhythm, children laughing on the green, the clatter of milk bottles, the distant chime of the church bell. But beneath it all, a current of unease ran strong. Miss Jane Marple sat at her small kitchen table, her teapot steaming, her knitting needles quiet for once. The clues were piling up like leaves in autumn. The cigarette butts, the brass button, the torn envelope, the scrap of fabric, Sally's shadow, the stranger's whistle. Each was a whisper of truth. And today Miss Marple intended to listen closely over tea. She had invited Sally, the milkmaid, to her cottage, hoping a cozy setting might loosen the girl's tongue. Sally's fear and guilt were threads that tugged at Miss Marple's mind, and she suspected the girl knew more than she realized. The kettle whistled, and Miss Marple poured tea into 2 delicate cups, setting out a plate of freshly baked scones. The scent of butter and jam filled the room, mingling with the faint lavender from her garden. She adjusted her shawl and waited, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles. A timid knock came at the door, and Sally entered, her bonnet askew, her hands twisting nervously. "Thank you for having me, Miss Marple," she said, her voice small. I didn't mean to miss tea before." "No trouble at all, dear," Miss Marple said, her smile warm. "Sit, have a scone. You've had a difficult week." Sally sat, her fingers crumbling the scone rather than eating it. Her eyes darted to the window, as if expecting someone to appear. Miss Marple poured tea, her movements slow and deliberate, giving the girl time to settle. "Now, Sally," she began, her tone gentle but firm. "You've told me about the shadow and the whistle by the barn, but I wonder if there's more. You were close to Mr. Harrow's farm every day. Did you ever see anything unusual before that morning?" Sally's cheeks flushed, and she sipped her tea, her hands trembling. I don't know, Miss Marple. It's all muddled in my head. Mr. Harrow was always cross, shouting about money or land, but a few days before he died, he was different. Quiet, like he was scared." "Scared?" Miss Marple repeated, her needles clicking as she reached for her knitting. "That's not like Mr. Harrow. Did he say why?" Sally shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "Not exactly, but he kept looking out his window, like he was waiting for someone. And once when I was leaving the milk, I heard him talking, muttering really. Something about not giving in and they won't get away with it." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her face stayed calm. "Did you see who he was talking to?" "No," Sally said, her voice barely a whisper. "I thought he was alone. But there was that whistle again, a day or 2 before, same as the morning he died. It came from the trees, soft like a signal." Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloging the detail. The whistle, mentioned twice now, was no coincidence. A signal, perhaps, to someone waiting or watching. "You've done well to remember, Sally. Anything else, even the smallest thing?" Sally hesitated, her fingers tightening on her cup. "There was a letter. I saw it on his kitchen table, maybe 3 days before he died. It wasn't open, but he was staring at it like it was bad news. I didn't see who it was from." Miss Marple's thoughts flicked to the torn envelope in her pocket, addressed to Harrow. Was it the same letter, or another. "Thank you, dear," she said, patting Sally's hand. "You've been very brave." Sally left, her steps lighter, but her eyes still shadowed. Miss Marple sat back, her knitting idle, her mind weaving the new threads. Harrow's fear, the whistle as a signal, the unopened letter. She thought of the stranger, always lingering at the edges of the story, and the fabric scrap from the trees. The puzzle was growing, but so was the pattern. Her next move was to visit Constable Reed, who was at the village hall, his desk cluttered with notes. He looked up as she entered, his young face tired but earnest. "Miss Marple, you're keeping busy," he said, managing a smile. "Any new ideas about Harrow?" "Just a few thoughts," she said, settling into a chair. "Have you learned anything more about his debts? I heard he owed money to several people." Reed nodded, flipping through his notebook. "Aye, he did. A few pounds to Mrs. Price for bread, some to Mr. Green for meat. But there's more. Found. A ledger in his house. He owed a big sum to a bank in Much Benham, something about a loan for new equipment. He was behind on payments." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "A bank loan? Did they send anyone to collect?" "Not that I know," Reed said, scratching his head. "But I'll check with the bank. Could be they sent someone, maybe that stranger folks keep mentioning." Miss Marple thanked him and left, her mind buzzing. A bank loan was a strong motive, especially if Harrow couldn't pay. The stranger might be a debt collector or something else. Someone Harrow feared, someone who whistled in the dark. She decided to revisit the Blue Boar, where the evening crowd would be gathering. The pub was lively, the air thick with laughter and the clink of glasses. Mr. Pye was behind the counter, his face red from the heat. Miss Marple took her usual corner, her lemonade untouched as she listened. Tom Blake was there, his voice loud as he argued with a farmer about crop prices. Miss Marple watched him, noting the tension in his shoulders, the quick glances he threw around the room. She caught Mr. Pye's eye and beckoned him over. "Mr. Pye," she said softly, "you mentioned the stranger watching Harrow and Tom that night. Did he leave anything behind besides cigarette butts?" Mr. Pye frowned, thinking. "Now you mention it, I found a handkerchief under his table after he left. Plain white, but it had a small mark. An anchor, embroidered in blue. Thought it was odd, but I kept it in case he came back." Miss Marple's heart skipped. An anchor, like the button in her pocket. "Might I see it?" she asked. Mr. Pye fetched it from a drawer, a crisp square of linen with a tiny anchor stitched in one corner. Miss Marple turned it over, noting a faint stain, lipstick perhaps, or blood. She thanked him and tucked it into her bag, her mind racing. The anchor tied the stranger to the button and perhaps to the fabric scrap. But the stain, what did it mean? As she left the pub, she saw Mrs. Clement hurrying across the green, her face pale. "Jane," she called, breathless. "I just remembered. Something? The night before Harrow died, I saw a light in his house late, maybe midnight. It was flickering like a candle. I thought it was odd. He always went to bed early." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts spinning. A candle at midnight, a whistle in the trees, a handkerchief with an anchor. The clues were piling up, each one a step closer to the truth. She returned home, her fire crackling, and sat with her knitting, the needles moving as her mind wove the pattern. The village was a web of secrets, and Harrow's death was its center. She thought of Sally's fear, Tom's anger, the stranger's shadow. She thought of another case, years ago, where a handkerchief had been the key, a forgotten clue that unraveled everything. This was no different. The truth was there, waiting in the quiet moments, ready to be found. As the village settled into night, its lights dim and its lanes silent, Miss Marple looked out her window. The hill loomed dark, Harrow's house a silent shadow. She was close, now closer than before. The tea had brought suspicion into focus, and she would follow it, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 8. The Locked Room. The 8th morning since old man Harrow's death greeted St. Mary Mead with a crisp breeze that rustled the leaves and set the village washing lines dancing. The sun was bright but cold, casting long shadows across. The lanes where villagers went about their chores with hurried steps and hushed voices. Miss Jane Marple stood at her cottage gate, her shawl snug against the chill, her knitting bag slung over her arm. The mystery of Harrow's death was a knot she was slowly untying, each clue a thread. The cigarette butts, the brass button with its anchor, the torn envelope, the scrap of fabric, Sally's shadow, the whistle in the trees, and now the handkerchief with its matching anchor and faint stain. Today, she felt, was a day for hidden places, places like Harrow's house where a locked room might hold answers. Her thoughts kept circling back to the house on the hill, where she'd found the smudged letter, the stopped clock, and the dented pillow. Mrs. Clement's mention of a flickering candle at midnight suggested someone had been there, someone who didn't belong. Miss Marple decided to return, this time with permission from Constable Reed to explore more thoroughly. She walked briskly, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel path, her eyes scanning the village for signs of the stranger who haunted every tale. At the village hall, she found Constable Reed sorting through papers, his young face etched with frustration. "Miss Marple," he said, looking up. "You're out early. Got any new theories?" "Only questions, I'm afraid," she replied, her smile gentle. "I'd like to look at Mr. Harrow's house again if I may. There's something about it that bothers me." Reed nodded, handing her a key. "I've been over it twice, but there's nothing to find. Locked tight when we got there, no signs of a break-in. Still, no harm in you looking." Miss Marple thanked him and made her way to the hill, the key heavy in her pocket. The house loomed as before, its gray stone walls stern and unwelcoming, its windows dark. She unlocked the door, the hinges creaking, and stepped inside. The air was colder now, the dust thicker, as if the house itself mourned its owner. She moved through the parlor, noting the stopped clock, still at 3:30, and the smudged letter on the desk, its words to Tom Blake as cryptic as ever. Upstairs, she paused at the guest room, where the dented pillow had caught her eye before. The bed was still neat, but she noticed something new. A faint crease in the rug, as if it had been moved and not quite set right. She knelt, her knees protesting, and lifted the rug's edge. Beneath was a trapdoor, its wood flush with the floor a small brass ring its only handle. Her heart quickened. A locked room within a locked house. Harrow's secret, perhaps? The trapdoor was stiff, but she pried it open, revealing a narrow ladder descending into darkness. She lit a candle from her bag, always prepared, like a good knitter with spare needles, and climbed down carefully. The air below was damp, smelling of earth and mildew. The space was small, a cellar of sorts, with stone walls and a dirt floor. Shelves lined one side, holding jars of preserves and old tools, but it was the wooden chest in the corner that drew her eye. The chest was locked, its padlock rusty but intact. Miss Marple examined it, noting scratches around the keyhole, fresh, as if someone had tried to force it. She didn't have the tools to open it, but she memorized its details. Oak, heavy, with a carved initial H on the lid. Whatever was inside, Harrow had wanted it hidden. She climbed back up, her candle flickering, and replaced the rug. The trapdoor was a discovery, but it raised more questions. Who else knew about it? The stranger, perhaps, or whoever had left. The pillow dented. She moved to Harrow's bedroom, searching for a key. The wardrobe held only clothes, the drawers only socks and papers, but under the mattress, she found a small notebook, its pages filled with numbers, dates, amounts, names. A ledger, perhaps, of Harrow's debts or dealings. One name stood out. J. Carter, with a sum of $200 beside it, marked urgent. Miss Marple tucked the notebook into her bag, her mind buzzing. A new name, a new thread. Outside, the breeze had sharpened, tugging at her shawl as she locked the door. She decided to visit Mrs. Price at the bakery, hoping to learn more about Harrow's debts. The bakery was warm, smelling of fresh bread and sugar, and Mrs. Price was kneading dough, her hands dusted with flour. "Miss Marple, you're everywhere these days," she said, smiling. "Still chasing Harrow's ghost?" "Just curious," Miss Marple replied, picking up a loaf to buy. "I heard Mr. Harrow owed money to a Mr. Carter. Do you know him?" Mrs. Price's hands paused, her eyes narrowing. Carter? That's John Carter, from Much Benham. He's a moneylender, not a nice sort. Harrow mentioned him once, said he was in deep with him. Didn't sound happy about it. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts racing. A moneylender, another motive, stronger than a land dispute. Did Carter ever come to the village? She asked. Not that I saw, Mrs. Price said. But he's got a man who collects for him, tall fellow, always in a dark coat. I saw him in Much Benham once, smoking those strong cigarettes. Miss Marple's heart skipped. The stranger, tied to Carter. She thanked Mrs. Price and left, her mind weaving the threads, the ledger, the chest, the moneylender's man. She decided to check with Mr. Green, the butcher, who might know more about Carter's collector. At the butcher shop, Mr. Green was wrapping a cut of beef, his apron stained. He nodded as she entered, his face wary. Miss Marple still poking. About? What's it now? Just a question, she said, her tone light. Do you know a Mr. Carter from Much Benham? I heard he lent money to Harrow. Mr. Green's knife paused, his eyes flicking to hers. Carter, aye. Nasty piece of work. His man came round last month asking after Harrow. Tall, dark coat, smoked like a factory. Didn't give his name, but he wasn't friendly. Did he come to the village often? Miss Marple asked. Once or twice, Mr. Green said. Saw him near Harrow's farm a week before the death. Looked like he was waiting for someone. Miss Marple thanked him and returned home, her mind a whirl of clues. The locked chest, the ledger with Carter's name, the stranger's cigarette. She sat by her fire, her knitting needles moving as her thoughts spun. The stranger was no longer a shadow. He was Carter's man, perhaps, sent to collect a debt Harrow couldn't pay. But a debt worth killing for? And what was in that chest? That evening, she walked to the Blue Boar where the crowd was thick with talk of Harrow. Sally was there, serving drinks, her hands steadier but her eyes still nervous. Miss Marple caught her at a quiet moment, her voice soft. Sally, dear, did Mr. Harrow ever mention a Mr. Carter? Sally's face paled, her tray wobbling. Once, ma'am. He said Carter was trouble, said he'd never get what he wanted. He sounded scared. Miss Marple nodded, her heart heavy. Fear, debts, a locked chest, a stranger. The pattern was clearer now, but not complete. She thought of another case years ago, where a hidden room had held the truth, a secret stash, a motive for murder. This was no different. The locked room was speaking, and she was listening. As night fell, the village grew quiet, its lights dim. Miss Marple looked out her window, the hill dark and silent. The truth was close, hidden in the locked places of Harrow's life. She would find it, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 9. A puzzle without pieces. The 9th morning since old man Harrow's death dawned with a pale sun struggling through thin clouds, casting a soft light over St. Mary Mead. The village was waking slowly, its lanes quiet except for the chirp of sparrows and the creak of a passing cart. Miss Jane Marple sat at her kitchen table, a cup of tea cooling beside her, her knitting needles still for once. The mystery was a puzzle with too many pieces missing, or so it seemed. The cigarette butts, the brass button with its anchor, the torn envelope, the scrap of fabric, the whistle in the trees, the handkerchief, the locked chest, and the ledger with John Carter's name were all threads, but they hung loose, refusing to form a clear picture. Today, Miss Marple resolved to find the edges of the puzzle, to see where the pieces might fit. Her thoughts kept returning to John Carter, the moneylender from Much Benham, and his man, the tall stranger in the dark coat who smoked cigarettes and left anchors in his wake. A debt worth $200 was no small matter, and Harrow's fear, as Sally had described, suggested Carter's man was more than a collector. Miss Marple decided to visit Much Benham where Carter's office was, to learn more about the man who might hold the key to Harrow's death. She wrapped her shawl, packed her knitting bag, and caught the morning bus to Much Benham, a bustling market town 5 miles away. The bus rattled along, its windows fogged with the breath of passengers, farmers, shopgirls, and a few schoolboys whispering in the back. Miss Marple sat near the front, her eyes on the passing fields, her mind turning over the clues. The locked chest in Harrow's cellar nagged at her. What was inside and who had tried to open it? The ledger's numbers hinted at secrets Harrow had kept, and the stranger's presence tied it all together. In much Benham, the streets were alive with market stalls, their vendors calling out prices for apples and cloth. Miss Marple made her way to the high street, where Carter's office sat above a tobacconist's shop. The air smelled of smoke and roasted chestnuts, a sharp contrast to St. Mary Mead's quiet lanes. She climbed the narrow stairs, her steps careful, and knocked on a door marked J. Carter Financial Services. A gruff voice called, "Come in," and she entered a small, cluttered office. John Carter was a broad man with a red face and a cigar clenched in his teeth. Papers littered his desk and a safe loomed in the corner, its steel glinting. "Good morning," Miss Marple said, her tone polite but firm. "I'm Jane Marple, from St. Mary Mead. I'm inquiring about a Mr. Harrow, who I believe was a client of yours." Carter's eyes narrowed, the cigar twitching. "Harrow, eh? What's this about? He's dead, I heard." "He is," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair without invitation. "And I'm trying to understand why. I believe he owed you money, a significant sum." Carter leaned back, his chair creaking. "He owed me $200, yes. Took a loan last year for new farm equipment. Fell behind on payments, kept making excuses. I sent my man Barrett to collect, but Harrow was stubborn." "Barrett?" Miss Marple repeated, her heart quickening. "A tall man, dark coat, smokes cigarettes?" Carter nodded, puffing smoke. "That's him. William Barrett. Good at his job, but not much for talk. He went to St. Mary Mead a few times. Last one about a week ago. Didn't get much from Harrow, though." "Did Mr. Barrett visit Harrow the night before he died?" Miss Marple asked, her needles clicking as she pulled her knitting from her bag. Carter frowned, his eyes sharp. "Not that I know. Barrett's not the type to, well, you know. He's firm, but he doesn't cross lines. Why you think he's mixed up in this?" "Just curious," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "Did Mr. Harrow ever mention a chest in his cellar? Or anything he valued greatly?" Carter's face darkened. "A chest? No. But he hinted he had something tucked away. Collateral, he called it. Said it'd cover his debt if push came to shove. Never showed it, though." Miss Marple thanked him and left, her mind buzzing. William Barrett, the stranger, tied to Carter and Harrow's debt. A chest as collateral, locked and hidden. She stopped at the tobacconist's below, where a young clerk was stacking cigarette packets. "Excuse me," she said. "Do you sell the brand Mr. Barrett smokes? He works for Mr. Carter upstairs." The clerk nodded, pointing to a cheap brand with a red-tipped filter. "These ones. He buys 'em by the dozen. Strong smell, not my taste." Miss Marple bought a packet, noting the red tip matched the cigarette butt from the trees. Another thread, tighter now. She caught the bus back to St. Mary Mead, her thoughts on Barrett. Was he just a collector, or something more? Back in the village, she visited the vicarage, where Mrs. Clement was polishing silver, her hands quick, but her face worried. "Jane, you've been to much Benham," she said, setting down a spoon. "What did you find?" "Only pieces," Miss Marple said, sipping the tea Mrs. Clement offered. "Did Mr. Harrow ever mention a man named Barrett, or anything about a moneylender?" Mrs. Clement's eyes widened. "Barrett? I heard Harrow mention that name once at church. Said he was a vulture who wouldn't leave him alone. I thought it was just his temper talking." Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloging the detail. Barrett's presence was no secret, it seemed, but his role was still unclear. She decided to revisit the Blue Boar, where the evening crowd might offer more gossip. The pub was warm, its air thick with ale and chatter. Mr. Pye nodded as she took her corner table, her lemonade untouched. Tom Blake was there, quieter than usual, his eyes on his glass. Miss Marple watched him, noting the slump in his shoulders, the way his fingers tapped nervously. She approached Mr. Pye, her voice low. "Has that stranger Barrett been back since Harrow's death?" Mr. Pye shook his head. "Not seen him. But I heard from a traveler he was in Much Benham yesterday asking about train times. Might be leaving soon." Miss Marple's heart quickened. Leaving, or fleeing. She thanked him, and returned home, her mind a whirl of clues. Barrett's cigarettes, the anchor button, the locked chest, Harrow's fear. She sat by her fire, her knitting needles moving as her thoughts spun. The puzzle was missing pieces, but the shape was forming. A debt, a secret, a stranger. That night she walked to Harrow's farm, the moon casting shadows across the fields. The barn was silent, its tape fluttering in the breeze. She stood by the trees where Sally's shadow had fled, and listened. A faint whistle came from the distance, soft and fleeting. Her heart stilled. Barrett, or someone else? She didn't follow, but marked the direction, toward the mill road. Back at her cottage, she sat with her tea, the fire crackling. The puzzle was incomplete, but she was close. She thought of another case years ago where a moneylender's threat had led to murder. This was no different. The pieces were there, waiting to be placed. She would find them, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 10. The Vicar's Secret. The 10th morning since Old Man Harrow's death brought a quiet stillness to St. Mary Mead, the kind that settles after a storm, when the air feels heavy with secrets waiting to be uncovered. The sun hung low, painting the village in soft gold, but a chill lingered, nipping at fingers and noses. Miss Jane Marple stood at her cottage window, her tea steaming, her knitting untouched. The clues were piling up like coins in a jar. The cigarette butts, the brass button with its anchor, the torn envelope, the scrap of fabric, Sally's shadow, the whistle, the handkerchief, the locked chest, and John Carter's man, William Barrett. Each was a thread in a tapestry she was slowly weaving, but a new name kept tugging at her thoughts. Mr. Clement, the vicar, who had argued with Harrow over church donations and whose nervous manner hinted at more than he'd said. Miss Marple decided to visit the vicarage again, sensing that Mr. Clement's hesitation during their last talk held a key. She wrapped her shawl, tucked her knitting bag under her arm, and set out, her steps steady on the damp cobblestones. The village was waking, with the clatter of a milk cart and the chatter of children heading to school. She nodded to Mrs. Price, who was sweeping her bakery step, and waved to Tommy, who grinned before darting off. But her mind was on the vicar, whose kind eyes and fidgety hands suggested a secret he wasn't ready to share. The vicarage was a warm haven, its garden bright with late roses despite the season. Mrs. Clement answered the door, her apron dusted, with flour, her smile welcoming but strained. "Jane, how lovely. Come in, I've just put the kettle on." "Thank you, dear," Miss Marple said, stepping into the cozy hall. "Is Mr. Clement about? I'd like a word if he's not too busy." Mrs. Clement's smile faltered. "He's in his study, but he's been out of sorts. All this talk of Harrow's death, it's upset him." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes gentle but sharp. "It's upset us all. I won't keep him long." She found Mr. Clement at his desk, surrounded by books and papers, his glasses fogged with worry. He looked up, startled, and pushed a ledger aside. "Miss Marple, good to see you. I suppose you're here about Harrow?" "Yes," she said, settling into a chair, her knitting bag at her feet. "You mentioned he was reluctant to give to the church fund. I wonder if there was more to it. He seemed troubled from what I've heard." Mr. Clement's fingers twitched, his eyes avoiding hers. "He was always troubled, Jane. Grumbling about money, land, debts. Our talk was nothing special, just his usual complaints." Miss Marple's needles clicked as she began knitting, the rhythm calming her thoughts. "But you said he mentioned someone bleeding him dry. That sounds serious. Did he name anyone? John Carter, perhaps?" Mr. Clement's face paled, his hands gripping the desk. "Carter? He didn't say that name, not to me. But he did say something odd, now I think of it. He said, 'The church won't save me, and neither will my secrets.' I thought he was just angry, but—" Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her face stayed calm. "Secrets," she repeated softly. "Did he ever mention a chest in his cellar?" or anything he kept hidden? Mr. Clement shook his head, but his eyes flicked to the ledger he'd pushed aside. No, nothing like that. He was private, you know. Didn't trust anyone, not even me. Miss Marple nodded, her gaze lingering on the ledger. Might I see the church accounts? Just to understand Harrow's donations. Mr. Clement hesitated, then slid the ledger across. It's all in order. Of course. Harrow gave less this year, but nothing unusual. She scanned the pages, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles. The numbers were neat, but one entry caught her attention. A donation from Harrow, dated a month ago, marked, for special fund. It was a large sum, $50, far more than his usual giving. She looked up, her voice gentle. This special fund, what was it for? Mr. Clement flushed, his fingers fumbling. Oh, just repairs for the church roof. Nothing important. But his voice trembled and Miss Marple knew he was hiding something. She thanked him and left, her mind buzzing. A special fund, a nervous vicar, Harrow's cryptic words. The church was part of the puzzle, and Mr. Clement was keeping a secret. She decided to visit the church itself to see if the special fund left any traces. The building was quiet, its pews empty, the air cool and scented with wax. She walked to the vestry where records were kept and found a box of receipts. Among them was a note, scribbled in Harrow's hand. For the roof, but keep it quiet. Don't trust Carter. Her heart skipped. Harrow had tied Carter to the church, and the vicar knew more than he'd said. On her way out, she paused at Ellen Harrow's grave, where the daisies still bloomed. A fresh bouquet had been added, tied with a blue ribbon. She knelt, noting a tiny mark on the ribbon, an anchor embroidered in white. Her breath caught. The anchor again, linking the grave to the button, the handkerchief, and Barrett. She returned to the village, stopping at the post office to ask Mrs. Wicks about the ribbon. The postmistress shook her head. Never seen one like that, but it's fancy, not from here. Maybe from Much Benham? Miss Marple thanked her and headed to the Blue Boar where the lunchtime crowd was gathering. Mr. Pye was polishing glasses, his face cheerful but his eyes watchful. Miss Marple, you're keeping us busy, he said, pouring her lemonade. Any news on Harrow? Just questions, she said, settling at her corner table. Have you heard of a special fund at the church? Harrow gave a large sum last month. Mr. Pye frowned, wiping his hands. Heard something about it. The vicar was cagey, said it was for the roof, but nobody's seen any repairs. Odd that. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts racing. A secret fund, a nervous vicar, an anchor on a ribbon. She spotted Sally across the pub, her tray steady but her eyes red. Miss Marple beckoned her over, her voice soft. Sally, dear, have you seen anyone at Mrs. Harrow's grave, someone leaving flowers? Sally nodded, her voice low. I saw a man there a few days before Mr. Harrow died. Tall, dark coat. He left daisies tied with a blue ribbon. I thought it was strange. He didn't look like he knew her. Miss Marple's heart quickened. Barrett, again tied to Ellen. Harrow. She thanked Sally and returned home, her mind a whirl of clues. The vicar's secret, the special fund, the anchor ribbon. She sat by her fire, her knitting needles moving as her thoughts spun. The church was a new piece, and Mr. Clement's nervousness was a thread she'd pull. She thought of another case years ago, where a vicar's secret had unraveled a crime, a hidden debt, a guilty conscience. This was no different. The pieces were there, scattered, but real. As the village settled into night, its lights dim, Miss Marple looked out her window. The hill loomed dark, Harrow's house silent. The truth was close, hidden in the vicar's secret. She would find it, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 11. Whispers in the Fog. The 11th morning since old man Harrow's death wrapped St. Mary Mead in a thick fog, so dense it blurred the cottages into soft shapes and muffled the sounds of the village waking. The air was damp, carrying the scent of wet leaves and chimney smoke, and the church bell tolled faintly like a voice calling through a dream. Miss Jane Marple stood at her cottage door, her shawl tight against the chill, her knitting bag slung over her arm. The fog felt fitting, a veil over the mystery that matched the tangle of clues she'd gathered. The cigarette butts, the brass button with its anchor, the torn envelope, the scrap of fabric, Sally's shadow, the whistle, the handkerchief, the locked chest, the ledger with John Carter's name, and now the vicar's secret about a special church fund. Each clue was a whisper, and in the fog Miss Marple intended to listen closely. Her thoughts were on Mr. Clement's nervous fidgeting and the note in Harrow's hand about Carter and the church fund. The vicar's secret was a thread she needed to pull, but the fog suggested another path. The mill road where Tommy had seen the stranger Barrett poking around the ruins. In this weather, tracks might linger, and secrets might show themselves. She decided to start there, then circle back to the vicarage. She walked slowly, her sensible shoes slipping on the wet path. The village was ghostly, with figures moving, like shadows. Mrs. Price carrying bread, Tommy darting through the mist, Sally's milk cart creaking faintly. Miss Marple nodded to them, her smile polite but her mind elsewhere. The mill road was a mile out, its overgrown track barely visible. In the fog, she moved carefully, her eyes scanning the ground for signs of Barrett's footprints or the paper Tommy had mentioned. The old mill loomed ahead, its broken wheels silent, its stones slick with moss. The fog clung to it, making the ruins seem like a forgotten castle. Miss Marple paused at the entrance, her breath catching as she heard a soft sound, a rustle, like leaves disturbed. She stood still, her heart steady, and listened. There it was again, followed by a faint whistle, the same Sally had described. Her fingers tightened on her bag. Someone was here, or had been. She stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The floor was littered with debris. Broken wood, glass, and a few cigarette butts, their red tips stark against the dirt. She crouched, noting they matched the brand from the tobacconist in Much Benham, Barrett's brand. Near a crumbled wall she found a fresh scuff mark, as if someone had kicked the dirt in haste. And there, half buried, was a small key, its brass tarnished but sturdy. Her heart quickened. A key, perhaps for the locked chest in Harrow's cellar. She slipped it into her pocket beside the button, the envelope scrap, and the fabric. The whistle came again, sharper now from the trees beyond the mill. She didn't follow, wary of the fog's cover, but marked the direction. Whoever was out there knew the mill was a place to hide, or to watch. She left the ruins, her steps careful, the fog wrapping around her like a cloak. Back in the village, she headed to the vicarage, where Mrs. Clement was in the kitchen, her hands busy with dough. "Jane, you're out in this fog?" she said, her voice warm but worried. "You'll catch a chill." "Just a short walk," Miss Marple said, settling at the table. "I've been thinking about Mr. Clement's special fund. It's curious, isn't it, that no roof repairs have started?" Mrs. Clement's hand stilled, her eyes flicking to the door. "It is odd, I suppose. Leonard says it's all in hand, but he's been so quiet lately. I think Harrow's death has upset him more than he lets on." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking as she pulled her knitting from her bag. "Did Mr. Harrow ever mention a key? Perhaps for something he kept safe?" Mrs. Clement frowned, wiping flour from her hands. "A key, no, but I saw him once at church slipping something into his pocket after a talk with Leonard. It looked like a small key, brass, I think. I didn't ask. It wasn't my place." Miss Marple's heart skipped, but her face stayed calm. The key in her pocket grew heavier. "And Mr. Clement? Has he mentioned John Carter or his man, Barrett?" Mrs. Clement's face paled. "Not Barrett, but Carter, yes. Leonard said Harrow was angry about a debt to Carter, said it was tied to the church somehow. I didn't understand, and Leonard wouldn't explain." Miss Marple thanked her and left, her mind racing. The key, the fund, Carter's debt. It was all connected, but how? She decided to visit Constable Reed to see if he'd learned more about Barrett or the bank loan. At the village hall, Reed was hunched over his desk, his notebook open. "Miss Marple, you're tireless," he said, managing a tired smile. "I checked with the bank in Much Benham. Harrow's loan was overdue and Carter's been pressing hard. Sent Barrett to collect 3 times in the last month." "Did Barrett visit the night Harrow died?" Miss Marple asked, her tone gentle. Reed shook his head. "No record of it, but Barrett's slippery. The bank said he was in Much Benham the day after, asking about trains. Might have been planning to leave." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts on the whistle in the fog. Barrett was close, perhaps closer than anyone knew. She showed Reed the key, careful not to mention the mill. "I found this near Harrow's farm. Could it be for something in his house?" Reed examined it, frowning. "Could be. There was that chest in the cellar, locked tight. I'll check it tomorrow, but you keep that safe for now." Miss Marple agreed, her mind already on the chest. She left the hall and headed to the Blue Boar where the evening crowd was gathering, their voices loud in the fog. Mr. Pye greeted her with a nod, pouring her lemonade. "Any sign of that stranger, Barrett?" she asked, settling at her corner table. "Not since last week," Mr. Pye said, wiping a glass. "But I heard something odd. Tommy's ma said he saw Barrett near the mill road again day before yesterday. Looked like he was hiding something." Miss Marple's heart quickened. Tommy again, always where he shouldn't be. She spotted him across the pub, sharing a pie with a friend. She beckoned him over, her smile kind. "Tommy, I heard you saw that man by the mill road," she said softly. "What was he doing?" Tommy's eyes widened, his voice low. "He was digging, Miss Marple, near the mill in the trees. Looked like he buried something small, then covered it quick. I didn't get close, he scared me." Miss Marple gave him a peppermint, her mind racing. Buried something. Another clue, hidden in the fog. She thanked him and returned home, the key heavy, in her pocket. The chest, the whistle, Barrett's digging. It was all part of the puzzle, but pieces were still missing. She sat by her fire, her knitting needles moving as her thoughts spun. The fog outside mirrored the mystery, hiding truths in plain sight. She thought of another case years ago where a key had unlocked a killer's secret. This was no different. The whispers in the fog were speaking, and she was listening, one careful stitch at a time. As the village sank into night, its lights faint in the mist, Miss Marple looked out her window. The hill was invisible, but she felt its presence. The truth was there, waiting to be found. Chapter 12. The Missing Motive. The 12th morning since Old Man Harrow's death draped St. Mary Mead in a lingering fog, thinner now but still cloaking the village in a soft gray veil. The air was sharp with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke, and the distant clatter of a cart echoed faintly through the lanes. Miss Jane Marple sat at her kitchen table, her tea steaming, her knitting needles quiet as she sifted through the clues that crowded her mind like pieces of an unfinished quilt. The cigarette butts, the brass button with its anchor, the torn envelope, the scrap of fabric, Sally's shadow, the whistle, the handkerchief, the locked chest, the ledger with John Carter's name, the vicar's secret fund, and the brass key from the mill road. Each was a thread, but the motive, the why behind Harrow's death, remained elusive, like a shadow in the fog. Miss Marple's thoughts circled around William Barrett, John Carter's man, whose dark coat and cigarette smoke haunted every corner of the mystery. A debt of $200 was a strong reason for trouble, but murder? She needed to know more about Barrett's movements and what he might have buried near the mill, as Tommy had seen. Today, she decided, she would follow that trail, starting with a visit to the mill road to search for Barrett's hiding place, then seeking out Dr. Haydock to discuss Harrow's death in detail. She wrapped her shawl, tucked her knitting bag under her arm, and stepped into the fog, her sensible shoes tapping softly on the cobblestones. The village was stirring, with Mrs. Wicks sorting letters at the post office and Mr. Green hosing down his shop step. Miss Marple nodded politely, her mind on the mill road. The path was muddy, its brambles glistening with dew. She moved, carefully, her eyes scanning for the spot Tommy had described. At the mill ruins, the air was heavy, the broken stones looming like ghosts in the fog. She found the trees where Tommy had seen Barrett digging, their roots tangled in the soft earth. She knelt, her knees aching, and brushed away leaves and dirt. There, beneath a thin layer of soil, was a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Her heart quickened as she unwrapped it, revealing a folded letter and a small vial of clear liquid stoppered tightly. The letter was addressed to W. Barrett, in a scrawled hand, with no signature, only the words, "Take care of it. No traces." The vial had no label, but its contents shimmered faintly in the dim light. Miss Marple's breath caught. A letter and a vial. Tools of a darker purpose? She tucked them into her bag, careful not to touch the vial's contents, and covered the hole. Barrett had hidden this for a reason, and she intended to find out why. The whistle she'd heard yesterday echoed in her mind, a signal perhaps to retrieve this very bundle. She headed to Dr. Haydock's surgery, where the village doctor was reviewing notes, his face grim. He looked up as she entered, his eyes, tired but kind. "Miss Marple, you're relentless," he said, offering a chair. "Still chasing Harrow's ghost?" "Trying to understand it," she said, settling down. "You said there was no poison in Harrow's body, no marks. Could something subtle have caused his death? Something hard to detect?" Dr. Haydock frowned, rubbing his chin. "It's possible. There are substances, rare ones, that can stop the heart without leaving much trace. Aconite, for instance, or certain plant extracts. But I'd need a sample to test, and Harrow's body showed nothing obvious." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts on the vial. "If I brought you something, a liquid perhaps, could you test it?" His eyes sharpened. "You found something? Bring it in and I'll do what I can, but be careful, Jane. If it's what you think, it's dangerous." She thanked him and left, her mind racing. The vial could be the key to Harrow's death, but why hide it? And why the letter to Barrett? She decided to visit the Blue Boar, where gossip might shed light on Barrett's movements. The pub was quiet at midday, with only a few farmers nursing pints. Mr. Pye greeted her with a nod, pouring her lemonade. "Miss Marple, you're a regular now," he said, smiling. "Any news on Harrow?" "Just questions," she said, settling at her corner table. "Have you heard anything about Barrett, the man in the dark coat?" "Tommy saw him near the mill road." Mr. Pye's brow creased. "Heard he was in Much Benham yesterday, asking about trains again. Sounds like he's planning to skip town. But there's talk he was seen near Harrow's farm the night before the death, lurking by the trees." Miss Marple's heart quickened. Barrett, always near, always slipping away. She thanked Mr. Pye and scanned the pub, spotting Sally clearing tables. The girl's hands were steady now, but her eyes were still shadowed. Miss Marple beckoned her over, her voice soft. "Sally, dear, have you seen that man Barrett since the morning Harrow died?" Sally's face paled, her tray wobbling. "Once, ma'am, 2 days ago. He was by the mill road looking nervous. I didn't stop, didn't want him to see me." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts on the buried bundle. "Did he ever speak to Mr. Harrow that you know?" Sally shook her head. "Not that I saw, but Mr. Harrow was scared of him. Said once that Carter's man would be the death of him." Miss Marple's breath caught. Harrow's own words, tying Barrett to his fear. She thanked Sally and headed to the post office, hoping Mrs. Wicks might know more about Barrett's letters. Mrs. Wicks was sorting mail, her hands quick. "Miss Marple, you're everywhere," she said, smiling. "What's it now?" "I'm curious about letters," Miss Marple said, her tone light. "Did Mr. Harrow receive anything from Much Benham recently, or from a man named Barrett?" Mrs. Wicks frowned, flipping through her ledger. "Nothing from Barrett, but Harrow got a letter from Much Benham a week before he died. No return address, just a plain envelope. He picked it up himself, looked angry about it." Miss Marple nodded, her mind on the torn envelope in her pocket. Another letter, perhaps the one Harrow burned. She thanked Mrs. Wicks and returned home, her bag heavy with the vial and letter. Sitting by her fire, she examined them. The letter's words, "Take care of it, no traces," were chilling, and the vial's contents glinted ominously. She wrapped them carefully, planning to take them to Dr. Haydock tomorrow. The fog thickened, as night fell, muffling the village. Miss Marple sat with her knitting, her needles moving as her thoughts spun. The motive was still missing, but the pieces were clearer. Barrett, the vial, the debt, the chest. She thought of another case, years ago, where a hidden poison had been the key. This was no different. The whispers in the fog were growing louder, and she was close to the truth, one careful stitch at a time. As the village slept, its lights dim, Miss Marple looked out her window. The hill was lost in the fog, but she felt its secrets calling. The motive would come, and with it, the truth. Chapter 13. A Trail of Nothing. The 13th morning since Old Man Harrow's death dawned with a lifting fog, the village of St. Mary Mead emerging like a picture coming into focus. The air was crisp, scented with damp grass and the faint smoke of morning fires, and the sun peeked through scattered clouds, casting a hesitant light. Miss Jane Marple stood at her cottage door, her shawl snug against the chill, her knitting bag in hand. The mystery was a stubborn knot, but she had threads to pull. The cigarette butts, the brass button with its anchor, the torn envelope, the scrap of fabric, Sally's shadow, the whistle, the handkerchief, the locked chest, the ledger with John Carter's name, the vicar's secret fund, the brass key, and the buried bundle with its cryptic letter and vial. Yet, despite these clues, the trail seemed to lead nowhere. A trail of nothing, as if the truth itself were hiding in plain sight. Miss Marple's thoughts were on the vial and its letter, now safely tucked in her bag, waiting for Dr. Haydock's analysis. The words, "Take care of it." No traces echoed in her mind, suggesting a deliberate act, perhaps poison, but the motive remained elusive. William Barrett, Carter's man, was at the heart of it, yet he was a shadow, slipping through the village and leaving only whispers. Today she decided to follow the trail of nothing, to search for what wasn't there, the absences that spoke as loudly as the clues. Her first stop was Dr. Haydock's surgery, where she handed over the vial and letter. The doctor's eyes widened as he took them, his face grim. "Jane, you're playing a dangerous game," he said, holding the vial to the light. "This could be anything, poison, medicine, or just water. I'll test it, but it'll take a day or two. The letter's troubling, though. No traces sounds like trouble." "I trust you'll be careful," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle but firm. "If it's poison, it might explain how Harrow died without a mark." Dr. Haydock nodded, locking the vial in a drawer. "I'll let you know as soon as I have answers. But watch yourself, Jane. Whoever hid this won't be happy it's found." She thanked him and left, her mind on Barrett. If he'd hidden the vial, he'd been at the mill recently, perhaps watching to see if it was safe. She decided to return to the mill road, to look for signs of his return. The path was quieter now, the fog gone, but the ground was still soft, holding footprints like a memory. She found the spot where she'd dug up the bundle, now undisturbed, but nearby, a fresh cigarette butt lay in the grass, its red tip matching Barrett's brand. Her heart quickened. He'd been back, perhaps, last night after she'd heard the whistle. She searched the trees, her eyes sharp. A broken twig caught her attention, leading to a small clearing where the earth was disturbed. Not dug, but pressed, as if someone had stood there for a long time. She found no more clues, but the absence of something, another letter, a tool, a trace, felt significant. Barrett was careful, leaving nothing behind but smoke and shadows. Her next stop was the Blue Boar, where the midday crowd was thin but talkative. Mr. Pye greeted her with a nod, pouring her lemonade. "Miss Marple, you're like a hound on a scent," he said, smiling. "Any closer to solving Harrow's mystery?" "Perhaps," she said, settling at her corner table. "Have you heard anything new about Barrett, the man in the dark coat?" Mr. Pye frowned, wiping a glass. "Not much, but a traveler yesterday said he saw a man like him in Much Benham near the train station carrying a small bag. Looked like he was in a hurry." Miss Marple's needles clicked as she pulled her knitting from her bag. Barrett, always moving, always leaving. "Did anyone see him here in the village after Harrow's death?" she asked. Mr. Pye shook his head. Not here. But Tommy's ma said he was near the mill road again, night before last. Said he looked spooked, kept looking over his shoulder. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts on Tommy's story of Barrett digging. She spotted Sally across the pub, her tray steady but her eyes nervous. Miss Marple beckoned her over, her voice soft. Sally, dear, have you seen Barrett since you saw him by the mill road? Sally's face paled, her hands twisting her apron. Not since then, ma'am, but I heard something last night near the farm. That whistle again, soft like it was far off. It scared me. Miss Marple's heart skipped. The whistle, persistent, a signal in the dark. Did you see anyone? She asked. Sally shook her head. Too foggy and I didn't go close, but it was near the barn, I'm sure. Miss Marple thanked her and left, her mind racing. The whistle, the cigarette, the pressed earth. Barrett was circling, but why? She decided to visit Constable Reed, to see if he'd checked the chest in Harrow's cellar with the key she'd found. At the village hall, Reed was sorting papers, his face weary. Miss Marple, you're keeping me busy, he said, managing a smile. I tried that key on the chest, it fits. Found some old papers inside, nothing clear, but there was a note about Carter saying he'll get nothing. Looks like Harrow was planning to fight him. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Anything else in the chest? Valuables, perhaps? Reed shook his head. Just papers and a few coins. If there was something valuable, it's gone now. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts on the chest as collateral. Something was missing, something Harrow had hidden, something Barrett wanted. She thanked Reed and headed to the vicarage, hoping Mrs. Clement might have more on the church fund. Mrs. Clement was in the garden, pruning roses, her face worried. Jane, you're out again, she said, setting down her shears. Leonard's still upset about Harrow. I wish I knew why. Miss Marple settled on a bench, her needles clicking. I'm curious about that special fund. Did Mr. Clement ever say what Harrow's donation was really for? Mrs. Clement hesitated, her eyes darting to the house. He said it was for the roof, but I heard him talking to someone last week late at night. He mentioned Harrow and something about keeping it safe. I didn't ask. It felt private. Miss Marple's heart quickened. Another secret tied to the church. Did you see who he was talking to? She asked. Mrs. Clement shook her head. It was too dark, but the voice was low, not from the village. I thought it was odd, but with Harrow's death, I forgot until now. Miss Marple thanked her and returned home, her mind a whirl of clues. The vial, the letter, the whistle, the empty chest. The trail seemed to lead nowhere. But that was the trick. Nothing was itself a clue. She sat by her fire, her knitting steady, and thought of another case years ago where an empty box had held the truth. This was no different. The trail of nothing was leading somewhere, and she would follow it, one careful stitch at a time. As night fell, the village hushed, its lights faint in the lingering fog. Miss Marple looked out her window, the hill a shadow in the distance. The truth was close, hidden in the absences. She would find it, one whisper at a time. Chapter 14. The Garden of Secrets. The 14th morning since Old Man Harrow's death greeted St. Mary Mead with a gentle breeze that swept away the last wisps of fog, leaving the village bathed in clear, pale sunlight. The air smelled of fresh grass and blooming roses, a deceptive sweetness that masked the undercurrent of unease rippling through the lanes. Miss Jane Marple stood in her garden, pruning her own roses with careful snips, her knitting bag resting on a nearby bench. Her mind was far from the flowers, tangled in the growing web of clues. The cigarette butts, the brass button with its anchor, the torn envelope, the scrap of fabric, Sally's shadow, the whistle, the handkerchief, the locked chest, the ledger, with John Carter's name, the vicar's secret fund, the brass key, and the buried bundle with its cryptic letter and vial. The trail seemed to vanish at every turn, but Miss Marple knew that secrets, like weeds, often hid in the most tended gardens. Her thoughts lingered on the vial, now with Dr. Haydock for testing, and the letter's chilling words, "Take care of it." No traces. William Barrett Carter's man was the shadow behind it all, but the motive, why Harrow had died without a mark, remained elusive. She decided to focus on the garden of Harrow's house, where the daisies on Ellen Harrow's grave tied with an anchor-embroidered ribbon suggested a connection to Barrett. Gardens, Miss Marple knew, held secrets as well as houses did, and Harrow's overgrown plot might reveal more. She wrapped her shawl, picked up her knitting bag, and set out for the hill, her steps steady despite the slight ache in her knees. The village was alive with morning chatter. Mrs. Wicks sorting mail, Mr. Green sharpening his knives, children laughing on the green. Miss Marple nodded politely, her mind on the garden. The path to Harrow's house was quiet, the sheep in the fields grazing peacefully, their bleats soft in the clear air. At the house, the gate creaked as she pushed it open. The garden was a tangle of weeds and thorns, but the rose bushes near the house were surprisingly well tended, their blooms bright against the gray stone. Miss Marple paused, her eyes narrowing. Someone had cared for these roses, and recently, Harrow wasn't known for gardening, and his wife had been gone for years. She knelt, her fingers brushing the soil, and found it freshly turned, as if dug and smoothed over. Her heart quickened. Another hiding place, perhaps? She searched carefully, her hands gentle in the dirt. Beneath a rose bush, she found a small metal box, rusted but intact, buried shallowly. It was unlocked, its lid stiff, but yielding. Inside was a single item, a locket silver with an anchor etched on its face. She opened it, revealing a faded photograph of Ellen Harrow, her smile soft but sad and a lock of dark hair. Miss Marple's breath caught. The anchor again, tying Ellen to Barrett's button and handkerchief. But why hide a locket in the garden? She tucked it into her pocket beside the key and other clues and continued her search. Near the garden's edge, where the path met the trees, she found a faint footprint, large like a man's, with a deep heel mark, as if someone had stood there, watching. Nearby, a cigarette butt lay in the grass, its red tip matching Barrett's brand. She didn't touch it but noted its freshness. Someone had been here, perhaps last night. Her next stop was the church to check Ellen Harrow's grave again. The daisies were still there, their blue ribbon bright in the sunlight. She examined it closely, confirming the anchor embroidery matched the locket and handkerchief. Someone was leaving tributes to Ellen. Someone tied to Barrett, or was it Barrett himself? She made a mental note to ask Sally if she'd seen anyone else at the grave. She headed to the Blue Boar, where the lunchtime crowd was gathering, their voices loud with speculation. Mr. Pye greeted her with a nod, pouring her lemonade. "Miss Marple, you're a fixture here," he said, smiling. "Still chasing Harrow's killer?" "Just looking for answers," she said, settling at her corner table. "Have you heard anything more about Barrett, the man in the dark coat?" Pye frowned, wiping his hands. "Not much, but a farmer said he saw a man like him near Harrow's house 2 nights ago, standing by the garden. Looked like he was waiting for someone." Miss Marple's heart quickened. Barrett in the garden, leaving cigarette butts. "Did anyone see what he was doing?" she asked. Mr. Pye shook his head. "Just standing, then he left toward the mill. Road. Odd place to go at night." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts on the buried bundle and the new locket. She spotted Sally across the pub, her tray steady but her eyes nervous. Miss Marple beckoned her over, her voice soft. "Sally, dear, have you seen anyone else at Mrs. Harrow's grave, besides the man with the daisies?" Sally hesitated, her fingers twisting her apron. "Once, ma'am. A week ago. A woman. Older. Not from the village. She left flowers, too. But I didn't see her face. She was quick. Gone before I could get close." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. A woman, a new figure in the puzzle. "Did she leave a ribbon like the one with the anchor?" Sally nodded. "Yes, blue, with that same mark. I thought it was strange, but I didn't tell anyone." Miss Marple thanked her and left, her mind racing. A woman, tied to Ellen Harrow, tied to Barrett. She decided to visit Mrs. Clement, who might know about visitors to the village. At the vicarage, Mrs. Clement was baking, her kitchen warm with the scent of bread. "Jane, you're out early," she said, offering a scone. Still on Harrow's trail? Always, Miss Marple said, settling at the table. Have you seen a woman not from the village visiting recently? Perhaps at the church or Harrow's grave? Mrs. Clement frowned, her hands pausing. There was someone, maybe 10 days ago. Older, city clothes, dark hair. She came to Evensong, sat alone, left flowers at Ellen's grave. I didn't recognize her, but she seemed sad. Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking. Did she speak to anyone? Mr. Clement, perhaps? Not that I saw, Mrs. Clement said. But Leonard was odd after she left, quieter than usual. I thought it was just the service. Miss Marple thanked her and returned home, her bag heavy with the locket. She sat by her fire, examining it closely. The anchor linked it to Barrett, but the woman. Who was she? A sister, a friend, a lover? She thought of the vial, still with Dr. Haydock, and the letter's words. No traces. The Garden of Secrets was blooming with clues, but the motive was still hidden. As night fell, the village grew quiet, its light soft in the clear air. Miss Marple sat with her knitting, her needles moving as her thoughts spun. The locket, the woman, Barrett's shadow, they were pieces of a puzzle, and the garden was telling its story. She thought of another case, years ago, where a hidden locket had revealed a killer's heart. This was no different. The truth was close, waiting in the garden's secrets, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 15. The Clock That Stopped. The 15th morning since Old Man Harrow's death greeted St. Mary Mead with a sharp frost, the grass crunching underfoot and the village rooftops sparkling like sugar-dusted cakes. The air was cold, carrying the clean scent of winter's approach, and the sun hung low, its light brittle but clear. Miss Jane Marple stood at her cottage window, her tea steaming, her knitting needles still as she gazed at the hill where Harrow's house loomed. The mystery was a clockwork puzzle, its gears turning but stuck at a crucial moment. The cigarette butts, the brass button with its anchor, the torn envelope, the scrap of fabric, Sally's shadow, the whistle, the handkerchief, the locked chest, the ledger with John Carter's name, the vicar's secret fund, the brass key, the buried vial and letter, and the locket from the garden. Each clue was a tick of the clock, but the stopped clock in Harrow's parlor, frozen at 3:30, nagged at her, a silent hint of when the crime might have happened. Miss Marple's thoughts were on time, when Harrow had died, when Barrett had been seen, when the mysterious woman left flowers at Ellen Harrow's grave. The clock stopped at 3:30 could mark the moment of death or something else, a meeting, a theft, a secret. She decided to return to Harrow's house to examine the clock closely, then seek out Dr. Haydock for results on the vial. Her shawl wrapped tight, she tucked her knitting bag under her arm and set out, her breath puffing in the frosty air. The village was quiet, its residents bundled against the cold. Mrs. Price was stacking bread in her bakery window, and Tommy darted past, his scarf trailing. Miss Marple nodded politely, her mind on the hill. The path to Harrow's house was icy, the sheep in the fields huddling together. She unlocked the door, the key heavy from Constable Reed, and stepped into the chilly parlor. The air was stale, the dust thicker now, and the clock on the mantel stood silent, its hand stuck at 3:30. She examined it closely, her fingers gentle. It was an old piece, brass and wood, with a heavy pendulum. The key to wind it was missing, and the mechanism was still, not broken but unwound. She frowned, her eyes narrowing. Someone had stopped it deliberately, or it had run down precisely at 3:30, morning or afternoon. She checked the window, noting the view of the garden and the path to the barn. If someone had been here at 3:30, they might have seen, or done, something. She moved to the kitchen where the single plate in the sink still sat, its gravy crusted. A thought struck her. The plate was fine china, not Harrow's usual fare. Had he had a guest? She searched the cupboards, finding only rough pottery, no matching china. The plate was an outsider, like the locket, the button, the woman at the grave. She made a mental note to ask Sally if Harrow had entertained visitors. Her next stop was Dr. Haydock's surgery. where the doctor was peering at a microscope, his face grim. He looked up as she entered, his eyes tired. "Jane, you've brought me a puzzle," he said, gesturing to the vial. "The liquid's aconite, a poison deadly in small doses. It can stop the heart without a trace, especially if diluted. Matches what might have killed Harrow, but I'd need more tests to be sure." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her face stayed calm. "Aconite," she repeated. "Could it be administered without Harrow knowing?" "Easily," Dr. Haydock said. "In tea, food, even a drink. No taste, no smell. But it's rare. Someone had to know what they were doing." She nodded, her thoughts on the letter. No traces. Barrett, or someone working with him, had planned carefully. "Thank you, doctor. Keep this quiet, please," he agreed, and she left, her mind racing. Aconite tied the vial to Harrow's death. But who had given it to him? She decided to visit the Blue Boar, where gossip might reveal more about the woman at Ellen's grave or Barrett's movements. The pub was warm, its midday crowd lively despite the cold. Mr. Pye greeted her with a nod, pouring her lemonade. "Miss Marple, you're braving the frost," he said, smiling. "Any closer to catching Harrow's killer?" "Just following threads," she said, settling at her corner table. "Have you heard of a woman visiting the village recently? Older, not local, perhaps at the church?" Mr. Pye frowned, wiping a glass. "Heard something from Mrs. Baker. She saw a woman at Ellen Harrow's grave, maybe a week before the death. Dark hair, city clothes, left daisies with a blue ribbon. Didn't talk to anyone, just came and went." Miss Marple's needles clicked as she pulled her knitting from her bag. "Did she meet anyone? Barrett, perhaps?" "Not that I know," Mr. Pye said. "But Barrett was around then, seen near the mill road. Might have crossed paths." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts on the locket and its anchor. She spotted Sally across the pub, her tray steady, but her eyes wary. Miss Marple beckoned her over, her voice soft. "Sally, dear, did Mr. Harrow ever have guests at his house? Someone who might have used fine china?" Sally hesitated, her fingers twisting her apron. "Not often, ma'am, but a few days before he died I saw a cup and saucer on his table. Fancy ones, not his. I thought it was odd, but he was so cross, I didn't ask." Miss Marple's heart skipped. A guest, perhaps the woman, perhaps Barrett. "Did you see anyone that day?" she asked. Sally shook her head. "Just heard him muttering about her coming back, didn't say who." Miss Marple thanked her and headed to the vicarage, hoping Mrs. Clement might know more about the woman. The vicarage was cozy, the fire crackling as Mrs. Clement polished silver. "Jane, you're out in this cold," she said, offering tea. "Still on Harrow's trail?" "Always," Miss Marple said, settling at the table. "I'm curious about that woman at Ellen's grave. Did Mr. Clement ever mention her?" Mrs. Clement's hands paused, her eyes worried. "He did once. Said she was Ellen's sister Clara from London. Came to pay respects but didn't stay long. Leonard seemed unsettled after she left." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Clara, a sister tied to Ellen, tied to the anchor. Did she meet anyone? Barrett, perhaps?" "Not that I know," Mrs. Clement said. "But Leonard said she asked about Harrow's debts, said she wanted to help. I thought it was kind, but he didn't agree." Miss Marple thanked her and returned home, her bag heavy with the locket. She sat by her fire examining it again. Clara, Ellen's sister, leaving flowers, asking about debts. Was she tied to Barrett, or working against him? The clock at 3:30 loomed in her mind. Had Clara been there, sharing tea, slipping aconite? Or was it Barrett, meeting Harrow in the dark? As night fell, the village grew silent, its lights dim in the frost. Miss Marple sat with her knitting, her needles moving as her thoughts spun. The clock had stopped, but the mystery was ticking forward. She thought of another case years ago, where a stopped clock had marked a killer's mistake. This was no different. The truth was close, hidden in the frozen moment, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 16. Shadows of the past, the 16th morning since old man Harrow's death dawned with a brittle clarity in St. Mary Mead. The frost of the previous day, giving way to a pale sun that sharpened the edges of the village. The air was cold, scented with pine and the faint smoke of morning fires, and the lanes glistened with melted ice. Miss Jane Marple sat at her kitchen table, her tea cooling, her knitting needles quiet as she sifted through the clues that crowded her mind like shadows in a storm: the cigarette butts, the brass button with its anchor, the torn envelope, the scrap of fabric, Sally's shadow, the whistle, the handkerchief, the locked chest, the ledger with John Carter's name, the vicar's secret fund, the brass key, the buried vial of aconite, the cryptic letter, the locket from the garden, and now Clara, Ellen Harrow's sister, who left flowers and asked about debts. Each clue was a shadow from the past, and Miss Marple was determined to bring them into the light. Her thoughts lingered on Clara, a new figure tied to Ellen's grave, and the anchor symbols that marked Barrett's trail. The stopped clock at 3:30, the fine china plate, and Dr. Haydock's confirmation of aconite as a possible cause of Harrow's death pointed to a deliberate act, but the connection between Clara, Barrett, and the motive remained elusive. Today, Miss Marple decided to trace Clara's shadow, starting with the church records to confirm her identity, then seeking out Constable Reed to learn more about Barrett's whereabouts. She wrapped her shawl, tucked her knitting bag under her arm, and set out, her breath puffing in the chilly air. The village was stirring, with Mr. Green sweeping his shop step and Mrs. Wicks sorting letters. Miss Marple nodded politely, her mind on the church. The stone building stood solemn, its spire catching the sun. Inside, the air was cool, scented, with wax and old wood. She headed to the vestry, where the parish records were kept, and found a dusty ledger of visitors and burials. Flipping through the pages, she found Ellen Harrow's entry. Died 5 years ago, buried with a simple service. A note in the margin in Mr. Clement's hand mentioned Clara Evans, Ellen's sister, as next of kin living in London. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Clara Evans, her surname different from Harrow's, suggesting marriage or estrangement. Another entry, dated 10 days ago, recorded Clara's visit to Evensong, confirming Mrs. Clement's story. But there was something else, a scribbled note. C. Evans asked about J. Harrow's debts, seemed anxious. Miss Marple's heart quickened. Clara's interest in Harrow's finances was no coincidence. She closed the ledger and headed to the village hall, where Constable Reed was reviewing notes, his young face etched with worry. "Miss Marple, you're up early," he said, offering a chair. "Any new leads?" "A few," she said, settling down. "Have you learned anything more about William Barrett? I heard he was seen in Much Benham near the train station. They nodded, flipping through his notebook. "Aye, he was there 2 days ago, asking about trains to London. Sounds like he's planning to leave, but no one's seen him since. I've got a man in Much Benham watching for him." Miss Marple's needles clicked as she pulled her knitting from her bag. "And Clara Evans, Ellen Harrow's sister? Has she been mentioned in your inquiries?" Reed frowned, scratching his head. "Not much. But Mrs. Price said she saw a woman, matching her description, near Harrow's house a week before the death, standing by the garden. Didn't speak to anyone, just watched." Miss Marple's heart skipped. "Clara, in the garden, where the locket was buried. Did Mrs. Price see her with anyone? Barrett, perhaps?" "Not that she said," Reed replied. "But Barrett was around then, near the mill road. Could have crossed paths." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts racing. Clara and Barrett, tied to the garden, the grave, the anchor. She thanked Reed and headed to the Blue Boar, where the lunchtime crowd might offer more gossip about Clara. The pub was warm, its air thick with the smell of ale and roasted meat. Mr. Pye greeted her with a nod, pouring her lemonade. "Miss Marple, you're keeping us on our toes," he said, smiling. "Still chasing Harrow's killer?" "Just following shadows," she said, settling at her corner table. "Have you heard anything about Clara Evans, Ellen Harrow's sister?" Mr. Pye's brow creased, wiping a glass. "Heard a bit from Mrs. Baker. She said Clara was in the village last month too, not just 10 days ago. Came to the pub once, ordered tea, asked about Harrow's health. Seemed worried, but didn't stay long." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Clara checking on Harrow months before his death. "Did she meet anyone here?" she asked. Not that I saw, Mr. Pye said, but she left a handkerchief behind, white with a little anchor on it. I kept it, thought she might come back. Miss Marple's heart quickened. Another anchor, matching the button, the locket, the ribbon. Might I see it? She asked. Mr. Pye fetched it from a drawer, a delicate square of linen with a blue anchor embroidered in the corner. Miss Marple turned it over, noting a faint stain, lipstick like the one on Barrett's handkerchief but a different shade. She thanked him and tucked it into her bag, her mind buzzing. Clara and Barrett, linked by anchors, but separate in their actions. She spotted Sally across the pub, her tray steady but her eyes nervous. Miss Marple beckoned her over, her voice soft. Sally, dear, did you ever see Clara Evans at Harrow's house? An older woman not from the village? Sally hesitated, her fingers twisting her apron. Once, ma'am, maybe 2 weeks before, he died. She was at the door talking to Mr. Harrow. He looked angry, sent her away. I didn't hear what they said. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts on the fine china plate. Did she leave anything behind? A cup, perhaps? Sally's eyes widened. Yes, a fancy cup and saucer like the one I saw later. I thought it was strange. Mr. Harrow never used those. Miss Marple thanked her and headed to the vicarage, hoping Mrs. Clement might know more about Clara's visits. The vicarage was cozy, the fire crackling as Mrs. Clement kneaded dough. Jane, you're tireless, she said, offering tea. Still on Harrow's trail? Always, Miss Marple said, settling at the table. I'm curious about Clara Evans. Did Mr. Clement ever mention why she was so interested in Harrow's deaths? Mrs. Clement's hands paused, her eyes worried. He said Clara felt guilty about Ellen's death, thought she could have helped them financially. She came to ask if Harrow needed money, but Leonard said Harrow refused her, said he didn't want her blood money. Miss Marple's heart skipped. Blood money, a strong phrase hinting at a deeper rift. Did Clara ever mention a man named Barrett? She asked. Not to me, Mrs. Clement said. But Leonard saw her near. The mill road once before she left. Thought she was just walking, but she looked secretive. Miss Marple thanked her and returned home, her bag heavy with the new handkerchief. She sat by her fire, examining it beside the locket and button. The anchors were identical, but Clara's stain was different from Barrett's. Were they working together or separately? The stopped clock at 3:30 loomed in her mind. Had Clara visited then, sharing tea, slipping aconite? Or was Barrett the poisoner, meeting Harrow in the dark? As night fell, the village grew silent, its lights dim in the pall cold. Miss Marple sat with her knitting, her needles moving as her thoughts spun. The shadows of the past, Ellen, Clara, Harrow, were converging, and the truth was close. She thought of another case years ago, where a family secret had unraveled. A crime, this was no different. The past was speaking, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 17. The Unseen. Guest. The 17th morning since old man Harrow's death brought a gentle thaw to St. Mary Mead, the frost melting into dew that sparkled on the village lawns. The air was fresh, scented with damp earth and the faint sweetness of late roses, and the sun climbed slowly, casting long shadows across the lanes. Miss Jane Marple stood at her garden gate, her shawl loose around her shoulders, her knitting bag in hand. The mystery was a tapestry with fraying edges, its threads tangling in her mind. The cigarette butts, the brass button with its anchor, the torn envelope, the scrap of fabric, Sally's shadow, the whistle, the handkerchief, the locked chest, the ledger with John Carter's name, the vicar's secret fund, the brass key, the buried vial of aconite, the cryptic letter, the locket from the garden, and Clara Evans, Ellen Harrow's sister, whose visits and questions about debts wove her into the puzzle. The fine china plate in Harrow's kitchen, used by an unseen guest, haunted Miss Marple's thoughts, a clue to a visitor who might have brought death. Her mind kept circling back to Clara and William Barrett, both tied to the anchor symbol, both present before Harrow's death. The aconite, confirmed by Dr. Haydock, pointed to poison, but who had administered it and why? Today, Miss Marple decided to trace the unseen guest, starting with a visit to Harrow's house to search for more signs of Clara's presence, then seeking out Mrs. Price for village gossip about strangers. She set out, her sensible shoes tapping on the cobblestones, the village waking around her. Mr. Green was hanging sausages in his shop window, and Mrs. Wicks waved from the post office. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts on the hill. The path to Harrow's house was soft with dew, the sheep grazing quietly in the fields. She unlocked the door, the air inside cold and heavy with dust. The parlor was unchanged, the stopped clock, still at 3:30, a silent marker of time frozen. She moved to the kitchen where the fine china plate sat in the sink, its gravy crusted. Beside it, half hidden by a cloth, was a matching saucer, its edge chipped. Miss Marple's heart quickened. Sally had mentioned a cup and saucer, but this was new. A pair, suggesting a shared meal or tea. She examined the saucer, noting a faint lipstick mark, pink, like the stain on Clara's handkerchief, but not Barrett's. She searched the kitchen, finding a teapot with dried leaves inside, enough for two. Someone had been here drinking tea with Harrow, perhaps at 3:30. Upstairs, she checked the guest room, where the dented pillow still lay. Under the bed, she found a single hair. Long, dark, not Harrow's gray. Her breath caught. Clara's hair, perhaps, or another woman's. She tucked it into a handkerchief, her mind racing. The unseen guest had slept here, shared tea, left traces. She checked the trap door to the cellar, where the locked chest had held only papers. The key from the mill road fit, as Reed had said, but the chest's emptiness nagged at her. Something was missing, something Harrow had valued. She left the house, locking the door, and headed to the bakery, where Mrs. Price was stacking loaves, her face bright but curious. "Miss Marple, you're up and about," she said, wiping her hands. "Still sniffing out Harrow's secrets?" "Just curious," Miss Marple said, picking up a bun. "Have you seen Clara Evans recently? Ellen Harrow's sister from London?" Mrs. Price's eyes widened, her voice lowering. "Saw her last week near the church. She was talking to a man. Tall, dark coat like that Barrett fellow. Looked like they were arguing, kept their voices low." Miss Marple's heart skipped. Clara and Barrett together. "Did you hear anything they said?" she asked. Mrs. Price shook her head. "Not much, but she said something about Ellen's share in not letting it go." He looked angry, walked off toward the mill road. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts on the locket and Ellen's photograph. Ellen's share. A legacy, perhaps, or something hidden in the chest. She thanked Mrs. Price and headed to the Blue Boar, where the lunchtime crowd might offer more. The pub was lively, its air thick with laughter and ale. Mr. Pye greeted her with a nod, pouring her lemonade. "Miss Marple, you're a regular," he said, smiling. "Any closer to solving Harrow's mystery?" "Getting there," she said, settling at her corner table. "Have you seen Clara Evans with Barrett, perhaps near the pub?" Mr. Pye frowned, wiping a glass. "Not here, but Mrs. Baker said she saw them by the mill road maybe 10 days ago. Looked like they were planning something, kept looking around." Miss Marple's needles clicked as she pulled her knitting from her bag. Clara and Barrett, plotting. "Did Mrs. Baker hear anything?" she asked. "Just a bit," Mr. Pye said. "Clara mentioned the chest and making it right. Barrett shushed her, said it wasn't safe to talk." Miss Marple's heart quickened, the chest again tied to Clara and Barrett. She spotted Sally across the pub, her tray steady, but her eyes nervous. Miss Marple beckoned her over, her voice soft. "Sally, dear, did you ever hear Mr. Harrow mention Clara, his sister-in-law?" Sally nodded, her voice low. "Once, ma'am, a month ago. He said she was meddling again, wanted something he wouldn't give. He was angry, said she'd bring trouble." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Trouble. Clara's visits, her questions about debts. "Did he say what she wanted?" she asked. Sally shook her head. "Just that it was about Ellen, something from the past. He wouldn't talk more." Miss Marple thanked her and headed to the vicarage, hoping Mr. Clement might shed light on Clara's motives. The vicarage was warm, the fire crackling as Mrs. Clement polished silver. "Jane, you're tireless," she said, offering tea. "Still chasing Harrow's killer?" "Always," Miss Marple said, settling at the table. "I'm curious about Clara Evans. Did Mr. Clement ever mention what she wanted from Harrow?" Mrs. Clement's hands paused, her eyes worried. "He said Clara was after something Ellen left behind. A keepsake, he thought, or money. Harrow refused her, said it was his now. Leonard tried to mediate, but it only made things worse." Missy Marple nodded, her thoughts on the locket and the chest. "Did Clara ever mention Barrett?" she asked. "Not to me," Mrs. Clement said. "But Leonard saw them together once near the church before Clara left. He thought they were arguing about money." Miss Marple thanked her and returned home, her bag heavy with the hair and handkerchiefs. She sat by her fire, examining the clues. The lipstick on Clara's handkerchief matched the saucer's mark, but not Barrett's stain. Clara had been the unseen guest, sharing tea, perhaps slipping aconite. But Barrett's role, his vial, his whistle, suggested he was more than a bystander. As night fell, the village grew silent, its lights dim in the cold. Miss Marple sat with her knitting, her needles moving as her thoughts spun. The unseen guest had left traces, lipstick, hair, a locket, but the motive was still hidden. She thought of another case, years ago, where a guest's secret had unraveled a crime. This was no different. The truth was close, waiting in the shadows of the past, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 18. The Weight of Silence. The 18th morning since Old Man Harrow's death dawned with a soft stillness over St. Mary Mead. The village bathed in a pale light that softened the edges of its cottages and lanes. A thin mist lingered, in the hollows, carrying the scent of damp leaves and the faint tang of wood smoke, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Miss Jane Marple sat at her kitchen table, her tea steaming, her knitting needles quiet, her mind heavy with the clues that pressed like stones, the cigarette butts, the brass button with its anchor, the torn envelope, the scrap of fabric, Sally's shadow, the whistle, the handkerchief, the locked chest, the ledger with John Carter's name, the vicar's secret fund, the brass key, the buried vial of aconite, the cryptic letter, the locket from the garden, Clara Evans's visits, and the fine china plate marking an unseen guest. The aconite, confirmed by Dr. Haydock, pointed to poison, but the silence, Harrow's refusal to name his fears, Clara's secretive motives, Barrett's elusive presence, carried a weight that Miss Marple could not ignore. Her thoughts were on the unseen guest, likely Clara, whose lipstick marked the saucer and whose dark hair lay under the guest room bed. But Barrett's role with his vial and whistle suggested a partnership or a betrayal. The locket with Ellen Harrow's photograph in the anchor hinted at a past that bound Clara, Barrett, and Harrow together. Today, Miss Marple decided to probe that past, starting with a visit to the church to re-examine Ellen's grave for more clues, then seeking out Constable Reed to press for news on Barrett's whereabouts. She wrapped her shawl, tucked her knitting bag under her arm, and stepped into the mist, her sensible shoes tapping softly on the cobblestones. The village was waking slowly, with Mr. Green arranging his shop's display and Mrs. Wicks sorting letters at the post office. Miss Marple nodded politely, her mind on the church. The graveyard was quiet, its stones glistening with dew. Ellen, Harrow's grave, stood apart, the daisies fresh, their blue ribbon with its anchor embroidery bright in the dim light. She knelt, her knees aching, and examined the soil. It was undisturbed, but a faint scratch on the headstone caught her eye, a small anchor etched recently, barely visible. Her heart quickened. Another mark, tying the grave to Barrett and Clara. She searched the surrounding grass, finding a single cigarette butt, its red tip matching Barrett's brand, half hidden under a leaf. It was fresh, no more than a day old. Barrett had been here, perhaps watching, perhaps leaving more than flowers. She tucked the butt into a handkerchief, her thoughts racing. The anchor, the cigarette, the locket. Ellen's memory was a thread weaving through the mystery, and someone was keeping it alive. Her next stop was the village hall, where Constable Reed was hunched over his desk, his notebook cluttered with scribbles. "Miss Marple, you're early," he said, rubbing his eyes. "Still chasing Harrow's killer?" "Trying to understand," she said, settling into a chair. "Any news on William Barrett? I heard he was in Much Benham, asking about trains." Reed nodded, flipping through his notes. "My man in Much. Benham saw him yesterday near the station, but he slipped away before we could nab him. Carrying a bag, looked nervous. Might be hiding nearby. Someone saw a light in the old mill last night." Miss Marple's heart skipped. The mill where she'd found the key and the buried vial. "And Clara Evans?" she asked. "Any sign of her?" Reed shook his head. "Not since her last visit, but Mrs. Price said she got a letter from London. A few days ago, addressed to C. Evans, care of the post office. She didn't pick it up yet." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "A letter, waiting for Clara. Might I see it?" she asked. Reed hesitated, then nodded. "It's not open, so it's tricky, but you've got a knack. I'll fetch it." He returned with a plain envelope, addressed, in a neat hand, no return address. Miss Marple turned it over, noting a faint smudge, lipstick pink like Clara's handkerchief. "I'll return it soon," she promised, tucking it into her bag. She thanked Reed and headed to the Blue Boar, where gossip might reveal more about Clara's letter or Barrett's hiding place. The pub was quiet at midday, its air warm with the scent of bread and ale. Mr. Pye greeted her with a nod, pouring her lemonade. "Miss Marple, you're a fixture," he said, smiling. "Any closer to catching Harrow's killer?" "Just following whispers," she said, settling at her corner table. "Have you heard anything about a letter for Clara Evans, or Barrett's movements?" Mr. Pye frowned, wiping a glass. "Mrs. Wicks mentioned the letter, said it came from London, looked important. As for Barrett, Tommy's ma saw him near the mill road 2 nights ago carrying a lantern. Looked like he was searching for something." Miss Marple's needles clicked as she pulled her knitting from her bag. "Barrett, at the mill, perhaps looking for the vial. Did Tommy see what he was doing?" she asked. Mr. Pye shook his head. "Just said he was poking around, muttering to himself. Tommy didn't get close, said the man looked dangerous." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts on the light in the mill. She spotted Sally across the pub, her tray steady but her eyes nervous. Miss Marple beckoned her over, her voice soft. "Sally, dear, did you ever hear Mr. Harrow mention Ellen's sister Clara in connection with anything specific?" "A keepsake, perhaps." Sally hesitated, her fingers twisting her apron. "Once, ma'am, a few weeks before he died. He said Clara wanted something Ellen left him, something worth more than gold. He laughed, said she'd never find it." Miss Marple's heart quickened. "The locket or something in the chest?" "Did he say where it was?" she asked. Sally shook her head. "Just that it was safe, where no one would look." Miss Marple thanked her and headed to the vicarage, hoping Mr. Clement might know more about Clara's quest. The vicarage was cozy, the fire crackling as Mrs. Clement baked scones. "Jane, you're out again," she said, offering tea. "Still on Harrow's trail?" "Always," Miss Marple said, settling at the table. "I'm curious about Clara Evans. Did Mr. Clement ever mention what she was after, beyond helping with Harrow's debts?" Mrs. Clement's hands paused, her eyes worried. "He said Clara was obsessed with a promise Ellen made, a legacy, something valuable. Harrow refused to give it up, said it was his by right. Leonard tried to calm her, but she was insistent." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts on the locket and the empty chest. "Did Clara ever mention Barrett?" she asked. "Not by name," Mrs. Clement said. "But Leonard saw her with a man near the mill before she left. Thought it was odd, but didn't ask." Miss Marple thanked her and returned home, her bag heavy with the letter and cigarette butt. She sat by her fire, examining the envelope. The lipstick smudge matched Clara's, but the lack of a return address suggested secrecy. She didn't open it. Ethics held her back, but its weight felt significant. The silence of the village, the absence of Barrett, the hidden legacy. It all pressed on her. As night fell, the village grew quiet, its lights dim in the mist. Miss Marple sat with her knitting, her needles moving as her thoughts spun. The unseen, guessed, the silent clues, the weight of the past. They were converging. She thought of another case years ago, where silence had hidden a killer's guilt. This was no different. The truth was close, waiting in the weight of silence, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 19. The letter, unopened. The 19th morning since Old Man Harrow's death draped St. Mary Mead in a gentle haze, the mist rising from the fields like a soft breath, softening the village's edges. The air was cool, scented with wet grass and the faint warmth of baking bread drifting from the bakery. The sun, barely cresting the hills, cast a pale glow that shimmered on the dew. Miss Jane Marple stood at her cottage door, her shawl snug against the morning chill, her knitting bag slung over her arm. The mystery was a puzzle with pieces that refused to fit neatly. The cigarette butts, the brass button with its anchor, the torn envelope, the scrap of fabric, Sally's shadow, the whistle, the handkerchief, the locked chest, the ledger with John Carter's name, the vicar's secret fund, the brass key, the buried vial of aconite, the cryptic letter, the locket from the garden, Clara Evans's visits, the fine china plate, and the unopened letter for Clara, smudged with her lipstick. The weight of silence from the previous day pressed on her, but the unopened letter still in her bag felt like a key to unlocking the truth. Miss Marple's thoughts were on Clara and William Barrett, whose anchors tied them to Ellen Harrow's memory and Harrow's death. The aconite, confirmed as a deadly poison, pointed to a careful killer, but the motive, tied to a legacy or debt, remained just out of reach. Today, she decided to focus on the letter, hoping its contents might reveal Clara's intentions and to revisit the mill road, where Barrett's light had been seen, for more signs of his presence. She also needed to check with Dr. Haydock for any further tests on the vial. She set out, her sensible shoes tapping on the damp cobblestones, the village stirring around her. Mrs. Price waved from her bakery, and Tommy darted past, his schoolbag bouncing. Miss Marple nodded, her mind on the letter. At the post office, she stopped to speak with Mrs. Wicks, who was sorting mail with quick hands. "Good morning, Mrs. Wicks," Miss Marple said, her tone light. "I'm still holding that letter for Clara Evans. Has anyone come for it?" Mrs. Wicks shook her head, her eyes curious. "Not yet, Miss Marple. It's odd, isn't it? A letter from London, just sitting there. You think it's tied to Harrow's death?" "Just curious," Miss Marple said, smiling. "Did you notice anything about it, the handwriting perhaps?" Mrs. Wicks frowned, thinking. "Neat like a man's hand, but the smudge. That pink lipstick makes me think a woman handled it. Could be Clara herself or someone close." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts on the lipstick matching Clara's handkerchief. She thanked Mrs. Wicks and headed to the mill road, hoping to find traces of Barrett's recent visit. The path was quiet, the mist clinging to the brambles, the old mill looming like a forgotten sentinel. She reached the clearing where she'd found the buried vial, her eyes scanning the ground. A fresh footprint, large with a deep heel, marked the soft earth, and nearby a cigarette butt with Barrett's red tip lay discarded. Her heart quickened. He'd been here, perhaps checking his hiding place, unaware she'd already taken the vial. She searched further, finding a torn scrap of paper caught in a thorn bush. It was a corner of a train ticket, stamped for Much Benham to London, dated yesterday. Miss Marple's breath caught. Barrett was planning to flee, or had already gone. She tucked the scrap into her bag, beside the letter and locket, and headed to Dr. Haydock's surgery to check on the vial. The doctor was at his desk, his face grim as he examined a report. "Jane, you've stirred up something dark," he said, looking up. "The aconite's pure, enough to kill in a single dose. I've sent a sample to a lab in Much Benham for confirmation, but it's almost certainly what killed Harrow. No taste, no smell, perfect for slipping into tea." Miss Marple's heart sank, but her face stayed calm. "Any chance it could be traced?" To a buyer, perhaps? Dr. Haydock shook his head. It's rare, but not impossible to get. Could be from a chemist or even a garden. Monkshood grows wild in some places. Whoever used it knew what they were doing. She thanked him and left, her mind racing. Aconite in tea, Clara's lipstick on the saucer, Barrett's vial. She decided to visit the Blue Boar, where gossip might shed light on Barrett's plans, or Clara's letter. The pub was warm, its midday crowd lively with talk of market prices and weather. Mr. Pye greeted her with a nod, pouring her lemonade. "Miss Marple, you're keeping us guessing," he said, smiling. "Any news on Harrow's killer?" "Just chasing shadows," she said, settling at her corner table. "Have you heard anything about Clara Evans's letter or Barrett's movements?" Mr. Pye frowned, wiping a glass. Mrs. Wicks mentioned the letter, said it looked important but no one's claimed it. As for Barrett, a traveler saw him in Much Benham last night near the station with a woman. Could have been Clara, but it was dark. Miss Marple's needles clicked as she pulled her knitting from her bag. Clara and Barrett together again. "Did the traveler hear anything?" she asked. "Just that they were arguing," Mr. Pye said. "Something about finishing it and no more risks. Sounded serious." Miss Marple's heart quickened. Finishing it? Harrow's death or something else? She spotted Sally across the pub, her tray steady but her eyes nervous. "Miss..." Marple beckoned her over, her voice soft. "Sally, dear, did you ever see Clara Evans with Barrett? Perhaps near Harrow's house?" Sally hesitated, her fingers twisting her apron. "Once, ma'am, maybe 2 weeks ago. They were by the garden, talking low. I didn't get close, but Clara looked upset, kept touching a locket around her neck." Miss Marple's breath caught. A locket, like the one in the garden. "Did you hear what they said?" she asked. Sally shook her head. "Just bits. Clara said Ellen deserved better, and Barrett told her to keep quiet. They left when they saw me." Miss Marple thanked her and headed to the vicarage, hoping Mr. Clement might know more about Clara's connection to Ellen's legacy. The vicarage was cozy, the fire crackling as Mrs. Clement polished silver. "Jane, you're relentless," she said, offering tea. "Still on Harrow's trail?" "Always," Miss Marple said, settling at the table. "I'm curious about Clara Evans. Did Mr. Clement ever mention what Ellen's legacy was, or why Clara was so determined to get it?" Mrs. Clement's hands paused, her eyes worried. "He said Ellen left something valuable, a family heirloom, maybe jewelry. Clara thought it was hers by right, but Harrow wouldn't budge. Leonard said it caused bad blood between them for years." "Miss Gray," Marple nodded, her thoughts on the locket and the empty chest. "Did Clara ever mention Barrett in connection with it?" she asked. "Not by name," Mrs. Clement said. "But Leonard saw them together near the mill road arguing about getting it back. He thought it was about money, but now I'm not sure." Miss Marple thanked her and returned home, her bag heavy with the letter, ticket scrap, and cigarette. But she sat by her fire examining the unopened envelope, the lipstick smudge, the neat handwriting. It was Clara's, but sent by whom? She didn't open it, respecting its privacy, but its presence felt like a challenge. The silence of the village, Barrett's flight, Clara's legacy, it was all converging. As night fell, the village grew quiet, its lights dim in the haze. Miss Marple sat with her knitting, her needles moving as her thoughts spun. The unopened letter held answers, but so did the shadows. Clara, Barrett, Ellen's ghost. She thought of another case years ago where a letter had revealed a killer's heart. This was no different. The truth was close, waiting in the words unopened, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 20. The Anchor's Burden. The 20th morning since Old Man Harrow's death greeted St. Mary Mead with a crisp dawn, the haze of the previous day lifting to reveal a sky of pale blue, streaked with wisps of cloud. The air was sharp, scented with frost and the faint warmth of chimney smoke, and the village stirred with the quiet rhythm of morning. Milk bottles clinking, footsteps crunching on gravel. Miss Jane Marple sat at her kitchen table, her tea steaming, her knitting needles still as she weighed the clues that pressed like a heavy anchor. The cigarette butts, the brass button with its anchor, the torn envelope, the scrap of fabric, Sally's shadow, the whistle, the handkerchief, the locked chest, the ledger with John Carter's name, the vicar's secret fund, the brass key, the buried vial of aconite, the cryptic letter, the locket from the garden, Clara Evans's visits, the fine china plate, the unopened letter smudged with Clara's lipstick, and the train ticket scrap pointing to Barrett's flight. The anchor symbol, tying Clara, Barrett, and Ellen Harrow together, was a burden that anchored the mystery, and Miss Marple was determined to lift it. Her thoughts were on the unopened letter, still in her bag, its contents a tantalizing unknown. Clara's connection to Ellen's legacy, perhaps the locket, perhaps something more, suggested a motive rooted in the past, while Barrett's vial of aconite and his furtive movements pointed to a killer's hand. Today Miss Marple decided to confront the anchor's burden head-on, starting with a visit to Constable Reed to share the train ticket and press for Barrett's capture, then returning to Harrow's house to search for traces of the legacy Clara sought. She wrapped her shawl, tucked her knitting bag under her arm, and set out, her breath puffing in the chilly air. The village was waking, with Mrs. Price arranging bread in her bakery window and Mr. Green sharpening his knives. Miss Marple nodded politely, her mind on the village hall. Constable Reed was at his desk, his face weary but alert, a map of much Benham spread before him. "Miss Marple, you're up early," he said, offering a chair. "Any new clues?" "A few," she said, settling down and pulling the train ticket scrap from her bag. "I found this near the Mill Road, stamped for Much Benham to London, dated yesterday. It suggests Barrett's planning to leave if he hasn't already." Reed's eyes widened as he took the scrap, his fingers tracing the date. "This is fresh. My man in Much Benham lost him last night, but this narrows it down. I'll send word to the station, see if he's been spotted." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking as she pulled her knitting from her bag. "And the letter for Clara Evans, has anyone claimed it?" "Not yet," Reed said, rubbing his chin. "It's still at the post office, but Mrs. Wicks said a man asked about it yesterday. Tall, dark coat, didn't give his name. Sounds like Barrett." Miss Marple's heart quickened. Barrett circling Clara's letter. "Could you have someone watch the post office?" she asked. "If Barrett's after it, he might show himself." Reed agreed, jotting a note. "Anything else?" "Just a thought," she said, her tone gentle. "The chest in Harrow's cellar? Was there anything to suggest what was missing? Clara Evans was after something Ellen left, something valuable." Reed frowned, flipping through his notebook. "Just papers and coins, like I said. But there was a space in the chest, like something small had been taken. A box, maybe, or a bag. No way to know what." Miss Marple thanked him and headed to Harrow's house, her mind on the chest and the locket. The path to the hill was quiet, the sheep grazing in the fields, their wool damp with dew. She unlocked the door, the air inside cold and heavy with dust. The parlor was unchanged, the stopped clock at 3:30, a silent sentinel. She moved to the trapdoor in the guest room, descending to the cellar with a candle from her bag. The chest stood in the corner, its oak solid, its padlock open from Reed's key. She examined it closely, noting the empty space Reed mentioned, a rectangular gap in the dust about the size of a small jewelry box. Her breath caught. Clara's legacy, perhaps, taken before or after Harrow's death. She searched the cellar, finding only jars and tools, but a faint scratch on the floor caught her eye, a drag mark, as if something heavy had been moved. It led to a loose stone in the wall, which she pried open, revealing a small cavity. Inside was a folded note, in Harrow's scrawl, "Clara will never have it. Ellen's gift stays with me." Miss Marple's heart sank. Harrow's defiance, his refusal to yield, had cost him his life. She tucked the note into her bag beside the locket and letter, and left the house, her thoughts racing. The legacy, jewelry, money or something else was the motive, and Clara and Barrett were both after it. She headed to the Blue Boar where the lunchtime crowd was gathering, their voices loud with talk of the weather and crops. Mr. Pye greeted her with a nod, pouring her lemonade. "Miss Marple, you're keeping us busy," he said, smiling. "Any closer to catching Harrow's killer?" "Just pulling threads," she said, settling at her corner table. "Have you heard anything new about Clara Evans or Barrett?" Mr. Pye frowned, wiping a glass. "Mrs. Baker said she saw Clara in Much Benham last week, near Carter's office. Looked like she was waiting for someone, maybe Barrett. And Tommy's ma said he saw Barrett near the Mill Road again last night with a lantern." Miss Marple's needles clicked as she knitted. Barrett, still here, still searching. "Did Tommy hear anything?" she asked. "Just that Barrett was muttering about finding it before she does," Mr. Pye said. "Sounded like he was in a hurry." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts on the note and the empty chest. She spotted Sally across the pub, her tray steady but her eyes nervous. Miss Marple beckoned her over, her voice soft. "Sally, dear, did Mr. Harrow ever mention what Ellen left him? Something Clara wanted?" Sally hesitated, her fingers twisting her apron. "Once, ma'am, a few months ago. He said Ellen gave him something precious, a piece of her heart. He kept it hidden, said no one would take it, not even Clara." Miss Marple's heart quickened. "The locket or something more?" "Did he say where he kept it?" she asked. Sally shook her head. "Just that it was safe where no one would think to look." Miss Marple thanked her and headed to the vicarage, hoping Mrs. Clement might know more about Ellen's gift. The vicarage was warm, the fire crackling as Mrs. Clement baked scones. "Jane, you're relentless," she said, offering tea. "Still, on Harrow's trail?" "Always," Miss Marple said, settling at the table. "I'm curious about Ellen Harrow's legacy. Did Mr. Clement ever mention what it was?" Mrs. Clement's hands paused, her eyes worried. "He said Ellen left Harrow a family heirloom, a necklace maybe, or a ring. Clara thought it belonged to her, said Ellen promised it to her before she died. Harrow wouldn't give it up, said it was his to keep." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts on the locket and the empty space in the chest. "Did Clara ever mention Barrett in connection with it?" she asked. "Not by name," Mrs. Clement said, "but Leonard saw them together near the church arguing about what was owed. He thought it was about money, but it sounded personal." Miss Marple thanked her and returned home, her bag heavy with the note, letter, and locket. She sat by her fire, examining the note again. Clara will never have it. The anchor symbols, the aconite, the legacy, it was all tied to Ellen's memory, a burden that had crushed Harrow. Clara and Barrett, allies or rivals, were chasing the same prize, and one of them had killed for it.